My name's Catherine. I'm a researcher at the Crypto Research and Design Lab, and I'm going to be your host for the next 3 hours of programming, but also the moderator for this panel on what makes hackathons successful. Before we begin, it's really important to acknowledge that the Austin Convention Center is on Indigenous land. And the reason for that is, and we'll get into this more in a second, is Web3athon is all about building hyperlocal solutions that solve some of the systemic injustices that exist in today's society. And one group that's been super affected by that is obviously Indigenous communities. So on that note, we'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the Indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. We'd like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Tehuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan-Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who've been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. This is also being live streamed to folks all over the world, so we invite you to identify the indigenous peoples of the land on which you reside. A link to nativeland.ca is in the description of this stream. And on that note, I would like to welcome you to this day's Web3athon programming. For those of you who don't know, Web3athon is a 3-month completely virtual hackathon. And the reason we've set it up this way is because we believe that the true utility of blockchain technology is going to come from people who understand the problems they're trying to solve. And the best way to do that is by looking where you live and seeing the problems you know about and what you can solve. So yesterday we had some amazing panels that went over some interesting use cases of blockchain. We talked about UX heuristics, which is a good first principle to start with as you're going into whatever your project might be. But today's panels are focused on each of our hyperlocal themes. Anyone who's trying to think of a project they want to work on that's going to be focused on one of these themes, we'll be setting you up with foundational knowledge so you can build with a real awareness. But before we dig into all that, today's first panel is about what makes hackathons successful. So if you've never been a part of a hackathon before, or if you have and you want to hear our take on it, we've brought together some of the most amazing panelists I can think of who are all super invested in creating an inclusive Web3 and using hackathons as a vehicle to achieve that change. So let's welcome our panelists to the stage.
After you.
Who's going first? Is it me? Hello. Hi.
As they're coming up, I'm just going to sort of dig into their introductions. Closest to me, we have Tracy Bowen, also known as Onali. She is the founder of HerDAO and a visionary and an activist. HerDAO is a woman-focused DAO focused on getting women into Web3. She's previously been an artist, a researcher, and civic tech entrepreneur, and she's been building Web3 social impact projects in DeFi infrastructure and NFTs. Up next, we have Coyote. He's the executive director of the Africa Blockchain Institute. He's a digital transformation enthusiast, and he's really motivated by academic diversity. He's also an African blockchain ecosystem leader. Next, we have Daniela Peralvo. She's the co-founder of Impacto, which is the first B Corp in Ecuador, and it's an ecosystem builder that supports impact startups, consulting services, and an impact investment fund. And of course, she's also a crypto enthusiast. And finally, we have Ellis Norman, who's the VP of Partnerships at HackerEarth, which is the global leader in hackathons and a community of over 7 million developers. And he is the turnkey partner for Web3athon. So for everyone looking to register, that's web3athon.hackerearth.com. But we're so glad to have you all on the stage. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I guess just to sort of set us up, Ellis, can you tell us what a hackathon is?
Absolutely. So a hackathon is essentially a structured exercise in innovation and problem solving. So traditionally, they're a 24-hour to weekend-long event that invites developers, innovators, and other enthusiasts to basically create solutions, apps, or other technologies around a theme or a sponsor's-specific technology. Great place for networking, for talent identification, for investment opportunities. And like you said with HackerEarth, with a 7 million developer community and ultimately as the largest provider of hackathons globally, we're really seeing a shift in hackathons currently, where they're being used more often as a kind of strategic resource within the toolkit to look forward to community growth and community building as well. And ultimately, like we had seen in the Web3athon, which is going on from now until the middle of September, we're focusing on a longer-term format that is a little bit more forgiving, gives some more space for education, and ultimately can provide for a better platform for better products at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I think what you were saying about hackathons being an opportunity to build community is really significant, especially to the work, Coyote, I know that you've done in building out sort of the hackathon ecosystem, not just like all over Africa, as I understand it.
Absolutely. So we all live in community where we have people from various backgrounds. Most of our neighbors could be lawyers, could be engineers, could be pilots. And the most interesting thing about you being in a particular community is that some of us don't even know that there's a particular problem operating in that particular community. The closest example is when we have a water pipe got burst in our community. That's evidence. Everybody knows that the water pipe have got busted, and we need to fix that. But there are more deeper problems that are not really open and visible for everybody to see. And that's when we now see somebody solving that particular problem, they'll be like, oh, that problem actually exists. It's not that those problems don't exist. The fact is that the problem actually exists. As a human being, we already have a tolerance level that we have put across to this particular problem. And so when we now realize that that problem exists, we're trying to put solution to it. Now back to community, is that being in community, we have those folks that I mentioned, astronaut, pilot, being our neighbor in that particular community. And the coming together of those folks participating in hackathon programs bring the change to the community they are looking for. And first is, if you have them participate in hackathon program, they get to go through several different dynamic challenges that need for them to understand. Can you hear me now?
Yay! You can try it for yourself.
Interesting. So, okay, just roll over back to community where we all have neighbors, where they're engineers, astronauts, and again, we have problems in our community that are not really quite visible for us to see until when somebody go ahead and produce solutions to this particular problem. Now, for those kind of community, when they come together as a community to work on an hackathon program, that is when we now have to see the change in that particular community. And that way, they're going to participate in hackathon program in different challenges for them to understand whether they even have a problem to start with, or what other problems are they not seeing that they're going to discover to the hackathon program. And second is about the experience. You know, hackathon, the juice of hackathon program is the experience, where we get to network and also where we get to learn. You know, this is a very interesting experience that we get from hackathon program. And the last one is about the implementation action. You know, it's good to learn about hackathon, it's good to be in hackathon program, but what are your action after the hackathon program? That's what happened to in community.
Well, I know that Impacto has a really interesting philosophy sort of around making sure projects are something that are sustainable. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Danielle? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So yeah, we have been working with impact startups in Latin America, so we have a lot of experience with Web2 hackathons. And from our experiences, like as you mentioned, it's all about the community, it's all about really falling in love with the problems and then going and develop the solutions. From that space, we have seen so many hackathon participants that they start with that solutions and then they actually scale them in all the different regions. So also becoming partners with other organizations like NGOs, like private sector, government, that's really key so we can actually have a better impact in what we are doing. But it's all about first the problem, it's all about the people, it's all about the partners, and then you can just go and scale the different solutions that we are developing.
Absolutely. One thing that has been really special about putting Web3athon together is that we're actually partnered with the city of Austin, where the folks who are in person are today. And the reason for that is it's a great example and an opportunity to show how some of these problems are showing up in actual communities. And so if you go to our Web3athon resources page, you'll see that each of our challenge briefs have actual data and actual information provided by the city to show you how these challenges show up in communities. And I think it's really exciting to use as an example to think about, well, how's that showing up where I live? Like, I don't live in Austin. It'd be pretty weird for me to tell people in Austin how to live as someone who doesn't live here. But if I say, oh, I know Austin has services that are designed to help them with disaster relief and response, what does that look like where I live? In any case, I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the hackathon experience, and especially about diversity at hackathons. We're really lucky that HackerEarth has such a huge developer community that's all around the world because it gives us that diversity. But Tracy, I know that a lot of your work is focused on bringing diversity to hackathons. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So Her DAO is a women-focused developer DAO. We've only been going for like 6 or 7 months, but we've helped hundreds of women access hackathons. And we've also provided travel scholarships because it's very costly sometimes to kind of travel. So we provided scholarships for people to come to conferences just like this, just like Consensus, And people have had such a great journey here because these conferences are really important for not just entering hackathons, but also progressing your career, learning more skills, gaining more knowledge, and networks. Networks are so important. So what we're actually doing as well is we're providing access. Access is, it's also the #1 thing that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, women, diverse people need because there's such a lack of representation and a lack of people like me and women and,
and the people on stage.
Yeah, true. So, Her DAO seeks to intervene in that and to help funnel those people in, and we've been really successful. Yes, amen. But we've been really successful at hackathons. We were in NFT Berlin a few weeks ago, and we managed to win over half of the prize money. Wow. Right? That is like Her DAO. So this is how powerful we have become. So we've become like a really great flagship for diversity, and we have lots of scholars here. Her DAO people, put your hands up. But we have lots of Her DAO people here, and CoinDesk and CRADL have obviously supported us. And yeah, we're just having a whale of a time. And we've got an amazing roadmap for the rest of the year, which I'll share later on.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, other folks on the panel, I know at Coyote we've talked about the importance of having people build for where they are, but why do we need diversity in tech and on these teams?
It's very important to have diversity because of trying to understand several problems that individuals are working on. Because organizing a program or organizing a hackathon program come with several challenges and several implications. And having different people coming from the various backgrounds, giving more value, more spice, and more understanding on how best to solve those problems at a particular time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Daniela, we've talked about the diversity, not just in the participants, but also having partners, right? People who are able to provide even a non-technical perspective to color the way you're approaching solving these problems. You'd mentioned a hackathon you'd worked on kind of recently. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So actually, when COVID started, we developed a series of hackathons that help especially women, migrants, and misinformation around COVID in Latin America. So we were partnering with different NGOs like Planned Parenthood Global, UNICEF, and several others in the government and private sector. And what we recognized was the importance of them bringing the data and also the storytelling. So people in the hackathon can really understood what was going on with these challenges. And from there, also, they helped validate the solutions. So they were also bringing the people. So we really knew if the solutions were working or not. And at the end, in one example that they developed, actually a cookbook called La Receta de la Vecina, a cookbook that actually helped women that were facing violence. Just with a secretly message in a cookbook, they were understanding if women were facing violence, and also they were understanding how to get out of that. That example was just launching in 2 months. There were like 6,000 cookbooks already. A lot of women were receiving those, and so actually these partners like the government and all the other organizations were helping to spread that. So that's really important. We can just make something bigger, develop this ecosystem, and not just having in one technology and one type of partner.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of having just one type of partner and the importance of having diversity there, Ellis, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the sponsors and partners that we have for Web3athon and our approach to having so many and why that matters for solving problems.
Absolutely. So as far as the sponsors are concerned for Web3athon, there are 17 sponsors across L1s, L2s, and various different projects. And we can kind of look at it like 17 individual hackathons all going on at one time. So a lot of fun, lots of opportunity, and basically the whole point here is bringing together diverse groups of talented individuals, both technical, non-technical, you name it, and having them actually design real solutions based on real problems, right, in their own location, in their own communities, whatever it might be. But then having basically the opportunity for them to come in, to submit their ideas to these various technologies. Those technologies and sponsors can then pick their favorite, bring them into the actual hackathon where they can try to create the best product possible, obviously. We've got over 50 prizes in this event, and there's over 150 opportunities for teams to be shortlisted, with right about 800,000 plus in prizes overall.
That's amazing. I'm so excited about this.
No small event.
Oh my goodness. I think the other piece about it that's great is we really want to make sure we're setting attendees up for success. I mean, especially from the technical perspective. Each of those sponsors have their own channel in Discord where you can ask them technical questions or non-technical questions. If you're trying to figure out how can I make my idea real, there's no better way to do that than providing resources and people to talk to help answer questions you have like that. But it's not just technical resources that set attendees up for success. I mean, Tracy, it sounds like you kind of crush it as far as making sure people are able to get the most out of hackathons. What's the secret sauce?
Well, we have a really, really good team. We have an excellent team leader in like Lena, and she's really crafted this really great program for scholars. And we also have Laura as well. So we just train people to mentor our scholars and our hackathon participants. There's a high degree of people who come with us who have never been to a hackathon and never participated in a hackathon. So there's a whole lot of prep that you have to do. So like maybe a couple of days before the hackathon, we'll kind of meet up online, go through, whatever prep needs to be done, go through questions, and just make sure people are comfortable and they know what to expect. Also, we like to form teams before we kind of get here. Sometimes we do it at the conference, but we were at the Hacker House a few days ago, just ideating and formulating what we were going to do and what tracks and what hackathons, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of support. Basically, mentorship and guidance and information dissemination. That's a key.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I know some of you who are joining online haven't been fortunate enough to have formed your team already, but what's great about Web3athon is also in the Discord, we have channels so you can meet up with people in your area, in your time zone, so that you actually have people to talk to in real time. I mean, having a team you can work with and sync quickly and riff on ideas who know about you that you can get to know. Community is really important for solving problems, but even looking just at your team in your hackathon, that's going to be how you get the most out of the experience. So if you're watching this, all of you, just drop something in the Discord to freaking introduce yourself so that you can meet some of the amazing people who are participating in this. I think as we're sort of wrapping up, one question I have is the importance of having blockchain, and the reason we have to have hackathons in blockchain, and we're thinking about making the space more inclusive. I'm curious, Ellis, I know we've talked about sort of HackerEarth has such a huge Web2 community, but bridging it over to Web3. Any thoughts?
I think it goes back to what Tracy just said. It's the accessibility of information. And it's also the logic flow that information is presented into the participants, where they need to know where that info is or who to ask for help at any point in time, which obviously in an on-site format is a little bit different than in a virtual format. But it all comes back to kind of micro communities within this actual hackathon that are all kind of supporting each other, right? So the transition from Web 2 to Web 3 is really no different. It's accessible information, it's micro communities basically supporting people, then helping them transition with as much easy documentation as possible, right? And low barriers to entry. And I think that candidly, that's the biggest kind of hurdle is getting people to understand how actually easy it is to participate in a hackathon, be it technical, non-technical, Web 2, Web 3, you name it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think the last thing, just before we wrap up, is what's one piece of advice you'd have for someone who's just starting at a hackathon? This is maybe their very, very first one. Anyone feel free to kick it off.
For me, I will encourage anybody to get into an hackathon program to have a very open mind, because you never can tell whatever thing you develop out of the hackathon program. Just be open and keep learning.
Yeah, and I guess it's all about the people. So, and popular sentence is like technology is not really the thing. It's about the people, the relationships, and the communities that you build. Be curious and share, and then great things will happen. We have seen that after hackathons, a few years later, a lot of startups just started from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I would piggyback off that and say, concentrate on mixed teams, mixed teams and mixed abilities. You don't have to have a team of rockstar, tech solidity developers. The tech side is important, but you also need, designers, project managers, make a holistic team, right, of diverse people, and you'll probably be more innovative and build a better project, basically.
And I think one thing that we talk, like diversity in tech, we're not the first panel on that ever in the world, but one thing that I think is under talked about is the importance of diversity of skill sets, as you're saying, because there's so many pieces of expertise that go into making a team. We've all been on a group project, hopefully, where you've been like, man, it could have gone differently if we just worked together a little better. That's a learned skill. Yeah. And so hackathons aren't just for learning how to build code, and it's not just learning how to build your project either, like learning how to work with people. Alice, I was wondering if you had any advice just as we're wrapping up.
So, yeah, I mean, it really is figuring out how to, well, don't be scared to say hello, right? Don't be scared to make an introduction, go meet new people, go talk to different people with different skill sets, and ultimately try to fill out that team that is strong where you're weak, right? And hopefully you can build a very balanced group that's able to bring a great product to market. And candidly, the more diverse your team is, the better your product's going to look, the better it's probably going to function, and ultimately the more use cases it's probably going to serve. So don't be scared.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the reason we're doing Web3athon is because what Ellis just said is true for hackathons, but that's true for all of Web3. We need to get as many different types of builders in the space who feel comfortable contributing their ideas and working together. That's how we're going to make those use cases that blockchain's promised us for decades, and how we're going to get more than just the early adopters at the table. Thank you all so much for joining us. This was amazing.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yay.
So really quickly, the next panel that we have is on generational wealth. Don't go away. We're going to do some quick mic swaps. If you want to talk to any of our speakers, be sure to meet them outside. But they're all amazing, so definitely try and talk to them if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Catherine. I'm the researcher at the Crypto Research and Design Lab, and I'm your host for the next several hours of programming. The reason we're here is for the Web3athon track of programming, which is a 3-month hackathon focused on 5 different hyperlocal themes. And this first theme is about generational wealth. And so I'm so excited to bring Trisha Wong onto the stage to moderate this panel. Trisha is the co-founder and director of CRADL. And the reason I'm really excited to have her moderate this panel is twofold. The first is her experience in tech is vast. She started selling some of the earliest text messaging technology, and she's been following the importance of data ethics and personal autonomy with data for the last several years, several decades. And the thing that's really most exciting is for financial health and for generational wealth, some of Trisha's previous work has to do with building out the financial system in Peru and bringing rural entrepreneurs into the financial system. And what she found is that it's not going to work for them because they have really different needs than the folks that banks are already addressing. So she takes a really culturally aware approach to fighting for equity and to helping people build generational wealth through her work. So please welcome Trisha Wong to the stage.
Is my mic on? I want to welcome, thank you, Catherine. Oh my God, it's day 2 of Web3athon. So I love to bring up my amazing panelists here. We have Henry from the New Mexico Community Capital Fund. Hello, Henry.
Hello,
and then
hello.
We also have Isaiah Jackson, who we were just on the panel on the main stage together, so we are like really sustaining the energy.
Oh yeah.
And we also have here Robbie Greenfield from, I have to say it's Umoja Lab, so I speak Spanish, so I'm always like Umoja, and you're like, no, it's Umoja. So we are here to talk about generational wealth. This is one of the 5 challenge areas of the Web3athon. Our whole theme is hyperlocal, but when you submit as a team, how many people are entering into the Web3athon? Raise your hands. How many teams are out there? Yes? I just wanted to see more hands, really? Okay, so by the end of this session, at least I'm going to try and convince you that perhaps that generational wealth is one of the challenge areas you want to enter in. And remember, this is no code is needed for the first stage of submission, which is why we brought up these 3 amazing leaders from their communities to talk about the process that they went through to really getting into Web3, and in particular, why they are so focused on building generational wealth. So I'm going to just do a quick introduction, which is Henry here. You have started in Digiverse, and one of our first conversations, you were like, yes, like us, indigenous people, we've always been in the multiverse. We've been, living on multiple layers. Like we've always known that the physical layer was just one layer. So it was an incredible conversation where you told me about how, you started looking at the cannabis industry. And then Isaiah, when we first had, I was like, oh my God, I'm watching you for years on, YouTube, one of the longest running YouTube shows. And here you are, second publication of Bitcoin and Black America, and you're going to be going on tour all over the world, and also now in Africa, all over, and you've been connecting with the Africa Blockchain Institute people. And then, Robbie Greenfield, if there's someone who's truly paved the way for doing social impact work in Web3, before it was even called Web3, it is truly Robbie Greenfield, who is now focusing on DeFi and emerging markets, and you are the founder and the CEO of Umoja Labs, and you're going to, and prior, you were also the founder of Consensus Impact Flag, social impact. So way before. So I want to start us off with a question. And we're going to keep this fast paced because we have 20 minutes on the clock and we're going to be on time, which is what is generational wealth to each of you? And we're going to interrupt each other because it's we're having drinks or having coffee, whatever. But what is generational wealth to you all? And I'm going to start first with Robbie.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Generational wealth, I can speak up, it's all right. Generational wealth, to me is enabling an entire lineage the ability to choose how they want to affect the world. Okay. Right, and I say that because oftentimes, especially from the Black community, when you matriculate from college or wherever you're coming from, you have to go into working regardless if you're passionate about it or whether you want to do it or not, and there's no choice in that pursuit of what that career is going to be. And there are a lot of constraints as to how you continue to live your life in terms of what you invest in, where you live, et cetera. And so really giving an entire lineage, an entire family, the ability to choose how they want to impact the world freely without the debt or constraints that might be attached to them because they did not have the capital to do so.
Well, I think we can all agree on that. Does anyone else have anything else to add, or you're like?
Oh yeah, well, I do want to throw in ownership. I think that's the biggest hurdle for people when they talk about generational wealth. You can have things while you're alive. If you can't pass it down, you don't own shit. There is no wealth to be passed down. So generational wealth starts with ownership, and then also the education to use it. So even if you do have a dumbass grandkid that wants to get rid of it, he can't do it because you have things in place to make sure that they don't mess up what you've built. So
This is
ownership.
a message to all dumbass grandkids.
Yeah, we all. I mean, every rich person or person that makes it has somebody in their lineage that can throw it away.
Screw it all up.
But this
Fuck it all
industry,
up.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This industry gets it, so they have the education, so they don't.
I'm going to come back to you and ask you how blockchain's going to prevent some dumbass from fucking up all their generational wealth.
We all got them.
Right.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of redefine wealth from an indigenous perspective, right? It's really about how much we give back, not how much we hoard. It's about health, right? I don't have generational wealth because my dad died at 50. My grandfather died at 50, right? Like, that's serious issues that we're facing in Native America. So we have to start from the scratch of like, how are we first gonna survive? How are we gonna really give back to our community? And thirdly, I wanna bring spirit into this, right? am I the first person who's talking about spirituality and Tao? Like, right? I'm not, I'm glad. And that's that power of that, right? Is like, that's the generational wealth that I'm talking about, right? That true technology, that connection to our ancestors. I'm wearing it right now in my shirt. This is my wealth. This is where I come from. This is my floral woodland design. This is my batok from my Filipino side. This is where I come from. That's my generational wealth. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm curious then, like, what does blockchain have to do with any of this stuff that we're talking about? Because generational wealth has always been an issue, right, for hundreds of years. But what's the real opportunity for, now we're talking about words like DeFi and NFTs and blockchain and Bitcoin. All three of you come at this from different perspectives. So I'm curious, like, what does that have anything to do with what we're talking about here at all?
I would say, it's really systematically capturing frameworks of value. And what I mean by that is that, and to your point, right, the only type of value, blockchain doesn't capture just monetary value in the form of cryptocurrencies. It can capture value in the form of impact, in the form of offsets, in the form of reputation. But the issue is that in order to ensure that you have a system that sustains generational wealth for typically underrepresented communities, you need to make sure that those frameworks, right, for that system have removed as many biases as possible.
What do you mean by a framework? Can you make it like a bit tangible?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of different frameworks in terms of how value is shared. I think one that isn't as common in the United States or in the West more generally, but is very common when you go onto the continent for Africa, is group savings and group lending, right? That is a framework to take a vulnerable community who is resource poor, right, and enable them to access financial services that they wouldn't otherwise have access to because they can't be banked, or maybe they can't even use mobile money because there are paywalls in mobile money.
And that happens everywhere. It's not just Africa. It's like we study that in Peru. Lauren Stroder, our co-founder CRADL, studies that in Myanmar, right?
Yeah.
But we forget that these other forms and frameworks and practices exist.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, and I would say transparency we have to put in there because, especially in my own community, we have IP that's been stolen, you have homes, you have land that's been stolen, and because it wasn't on the blockchain where we could verify it and everyone could see it, you could basically burn the papers or get rid of the records, and then here you are 3 generations later and you don't have generational wealth. So that transparency on the blockchain is important, and long term, your kids down the road, even the dumbass grandkid, you can see on the blockchain that this is what we owned and this is how we built it. So I think that's all important as well, and that's why blockchain is needed.
Yeah, I just agree with everything that you're saying, and even these types of events, like I'm learning so much just from these two, right? And I just want to do, like, we did a land acknowledgement, I want to do a technology acknowledgement. Blockchain is an indigenous technology, right? We know that. Let's give it up, come on. The island of Yappies, right? This is the history, we have to know that history.
Well, but you got to break it down. Like, not everyone understood what you just said. So break it down, because not also everyone, is from the US, so we have people around the country, around the world. What do you mean by, like, blockchain is an
The
indigenous
history and
technology.
legend.
Like, break it down.
So back in the day, we didn't have written languages, right? We had physical objects, and we had this big stone, right, on the island of Yap, and that's how they recorded transactions amongst community members. The same wampum shell, right, was how the Constitution was built of the U.S., right? So this is the type of knowledge and history that we have to educate, and that's why I believe in this technology, because it's inherently based in our culture. So everything they're talking about, that's why I'm all about it, because that's what's going to create that generational wealth.
What is it about the distributed nature of the technology now, a blockchain, that will enable some of the things that we're talking about? Because I want to get a bit practical, because we have builders in the audience who are technical and non-technical. So if we can understand, yes, spiritually and like historically, we get that the blockchain is not totally something new. We've had various forms of artifacts and distributed ledgers, but now it's just digital. But practically, like as a builder, like Robbie, what are you doing on the blockchain to enable generational wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have two answers for this. I'm going to go the protocol route because I'm a nerd first. But you take all of these historic artifacts, these historic patterns of how communities have stored, shared, and distributed wealth more generally, whether it be savings and lending. Those are generally the fundamental financial principles of most communities. It allows those type of social trust-built systems to scale. Right, and so, you know, the context or the example that I would use in a protocol situation is for lending groups. And for those who are unfamiliar with lending groups, we all got $10. We put $10 into the bucket, and one of us can take out a loan of $200 or $300, right? And then we make payments for the rest of those months, and then the next person gets to go, and then the next person gets to go. And this is how we can lend from each other. And of course, if any of us misses one of our payments, we know that person, like, yo, Rob, you need to submit your payment, man. Like, I want all my money back from this, right? And so, but this can only, right now, this can only sustain itself within villages of people who know each other.
Face to face, very physical.
Yes. And so when you map that onto a protocol that can exist on a blockchain that can scale, you can start to enable communities to create group saving models or group lending models across multiple continents of similar backgrounds. Smallholder farmers is a huge one. And so this is something that Umoja Labs is looking into, but even beyond that, one of the other things from a transparency perspective is making sure that the solutions that we use to provide someone else value, so in the context of humanitarian aid, being able to do that transparently and enabling that person to be able to on and off ramp to the current accounts that they have, like mobile money. And so it takes very small steps. What might start with payments, right, just to understand how can we reliably provide accessible technology for people to use this in the forefront, then translates into things that become a lot more complex, like savings and like and loans. So those are just two examples of how we can actually materialize, leverage the technology in underrepresented communities.
But DeFi is also seen as something that's been quite exploitive.
Yes. Yeah.
So what are you doing that's different?
Yes.
Because this is very important for all the builders out there. If you're going to be working in DeFi, we're talking about money and currency and people's livelihoods. What's going to be different about what you're doing at Umoja Labs, like as advice to all the builders out there?
The biggest thing is that you cannot have inflationary flywheels. And
break it down.
Yeah. So I told y'all earlier, I'm going to really go in on yield. We see these products out there that promise 30 to 40% APY.
It ain't happening.
Not a thing. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. They especially, and again, you know, this is not all the algo stablecoins. I think some of them, you know, are doing an okay job. But the issue is that me promising you 30% APY when I'm just minting tokens is not a sustainable model. There's a cost of acquisition for every token that I give you, right? And that cost is inflation. And so what happens is you are putting out there an economic system that is going to fail, and you're putting all the people who use that, you know, that currency as a store of value at great risk. And this happened with UST. What people don't talk about, and you brought this earlier on the main stage, is that UST was deployed in African communities, like smallholder farmer communities, as a test. And it failed, right?
There are some chains doing it right now,
yes.
And we're going to be researching that at CRADL because it's highly exploitive.
Yes, and so you need to have, when you go into any type of community, not just underserved communities, any type of community, because money is money and money is important to people to function, you need to be able to have a stablecoin analysis in terms of, okay, what form of value are you using? If that's USDC because the enterprises behind what that is are more trustworthy and there's collateral not only in terms of liquidity on-chain, but liquidity and the reputation of those organizations, then maybe that's something that you should start with. Or if that's DAI because there's a certain level of transparency, but know that every stablecoin has its risk. And USDC does as well, right? We're trusting that those institutions have money in the bank to back it. And so that's the first thing, is that we have a very, very critical stablecoin analysis in terms of what we allow on the protocols, what we allow in our products. But then also you need to have certain guarantees. You need to know that if you have 1,000 wallet holders for your wallet and they're using a stablecoin that might not necessarily be reliable, you need to provide them the guarantee that if that becomes depegged, their money is guaranteed. That you are going to cash them out to an off-ramp and they're going to be fine. And that's something that you have to take on as a responsibility because you want to grow your own company.
So what's
size.
your guarantee?
Our guarantee is that if it's depegged, your money's still guaranteed.
Oof.
And so those are two things. But then the second thing is you need to take steps to get certain things right. Payments in last mile environments is very difficult with cryptocurrency. Once you overcome that hurdle and allow people just to say, hey, this is 1,000 times less expensive than mobile money transfers. If you can achieve that, then you can move to the next step, which is savings and lending, which is 1,000 times more complex.
I mean, I'm curious. Oh, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to say, you said practical use cases for Web3. So right now in Miami, we have the Miami Bitcoin Summer Camp, as well as the Academy, and the main thing we're looking at is...
That you're making, that
yes.
this is yours.
Yes,
you're
absolutely.
one of the designers of this.
Yep, and the main thing is creating learn-to-earn Web3 programs and the gamification of education. The ultimate goal is to disintermediate public schools as much as possible, simply because they haven't worked and they're not working currently the way they should. And I'm not saying we have to get rid of them, but you need another option. And
especially because universities and schooling has been a way to build generational wealth.
Usually, yeah.
Communities are excluded. So I think it's crazy what you're saying. I actually was like, wait, what? You're getting rid of schools?
Yeah. Well, my mother was a teacher for 30 years, grandmother was a teacher for 40. I taught high school, and I've seen through the years how much public school has left out of education. When in reality, I know 15-year-olds that 2 or 3 years, they could be working in the industry using gamification of education. So actual practical use cases is the next generation. We're talking about generational wealth. The next generation, they're not going to learn the same way we did. So we have to start building that now and stop relying on whatever local government or whoever officials that may suck at their job. Then do it yourself.
So there are a few people, yes. There are a few people who I spoke to in the audience. Like I remember speaking to someone named Mosa who is building a Learn to Earn. You know, he's like an educator from Atlanta, and he's telling me like, you know, we need to start educating people in Web3 in simple ways. And you're an educator at heart, you know. So I'm curious, like, what's your advice for people who are going to create educational products for Web3athon as they're building? Like, what can you tell us a bit about what you're doing in Miami and, you know, some advice on practical stuff?
The main thing is meet them where they are. No matter who I deal with, meet them where they are. So if you look at what kids do today, they all play video games. They're all used to it. They're all pretty much on the internet since birth. I mean, every kid born now has a camera in his face as soon as they're born, iPad at 2 years old. So meet them where they are and have the ability for them to learn the same things they would sitting in a classroom, sitting at home or on their phone, and able to earn from it. Because I remember when I was in school, there were some kids, if you got A's, your parents give you $5, or if you got B's, they give you $3. In reality, when you reward people as an adult for your job, that's actually teaching them as a child. You get rewarded for good behavior as well as learning. So I think that's a perfect synergy to be able to get paid to learn, because you're going to get paid for the things you know later. So it's just a good start. So practically, if you're building that, the gamification and building in the earning model for students that they can either use, you know, early or that they can use once they turn 18.
But where does the money come from for Learn to Earn, like practically speaking?
Oh yeah, that's the good thing about education grants and scholarships, and as well as people in the local community. If you actually want to support education, you should be supporting it yourself and not relying on whatever tax base, because we see what happens. You have schools that failed. A lot of communities I was in, they failed because the tax base wasn't high enough.
So one of the themes for our hackathon, I mean, the whole overarching theme is hyperlocal. So what a way, if like a builder wanted to create a learn to earn kind of model, should they partner with a local organization to get grants? Even if it's like $100 as an experiment for the Web3athon, can they do it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can partner with local community banks, or you can partner with local companies that need talent. And if you say, hey, you need to know this to work here, we have this where we can teach students where they can come straight out of high school doing that. That's where you can get the money from.
Yeah. Can I share as a fellow past high school teacher as well? Yeah, I was a high school teacher before my job, and really what we do is we're a nonprofit, so we act as a fiscal sponsor for all our Native American entrepreneurs because they have social enterprises, and we just are able to talk about that and really give them, like, we're literally giving people their first laptop. We literally just got access to the internet during the pandemic, a lot of our communities. So the digital divide is real in New Mexico, and we have to be able to provide the hardware. We give every seed funds to all of our participants, no matter what they do, from $1,200 all the way to $15,000, no questions asked. When we create our loan funds, we have a 50% repayment loan, right? So that if something like that happens, we know that we got their back, and we even forgive loans. So now looking in Web3, we know we have to deploy $10 million in the next 5 years. Is there solutions that we could find to make it faster? Because I'll tell you right now, tribes, their biggest pain point is checks, believe it or not, right? Is that antiquated system of how do we get this money to our people? And the most important part is how do we create the shared governance? Because there was a structure put in place for us that was very hierarchical, and it's how we lost all of our land. It's how we lost all of our resources. So this idea that we could have people be at that power and make those decisions, I think that's the most powerful, reason why we're looking into Web3 and why we're creating these solutions.
Where did the $10 million come from that you just threw out there? I just talked about $100. Where did this money come from?
Luna airdrop.
I'll tell you, disgruntled ex-wives of billionaires. Melinda Gates and Mackenzie Scott.
Is that the new hyperlocal plan, advice for all these builders?
Yeah, make relations, put your story out there, you never know who's in the audience, and that's really what we found. We never thought that could be an opportunity, but we put it out there and we came up with a new worldview, and that's what's missing, right? We're still replicating the same worldview that's based in consumerism and capitalism and building money and getting as much money as possible. Well, we're going to see the same thing happen over and over again.
Plus a million.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking, Henry, you said something that just shook me, where you're like, we're using the same consciousness to build Web3 as we did for building Web 2. It was your words who said that. And
the beauty of it, though, is that now we're talking about multiple dimensions, which is stuff that we've already been talking about. We're talking about different ways of exchanging bartership, which we've already been doing. Decentralized autonomous organizations. That sounds like tribes to me. You know what I'm talking about? That was our original structure. Yet I'm the only Native American here with Palm out of 15,000 people, right?
Oh, no, I'm Native American too.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, it makes sense. That's why you're a leader.
So,
that's why you're a leader.
Exactly, yeah. And it's no cell phone service out there, so as you said.
No cell phone. Actually, can we just talk about that for a second? Yeah. 2 more minutes. But a digital divide is so important because with the blockchain, you actually need internet infrastructure to be able to transact. You need cell phone infrastructure. And let's think about this for a second. And people who are building in rural communities, how do we actually think about the blockchain when that's not even in place? And Robbie, you've been building in places like this. What do you see here?
Well, I was going to say mobile hotspots, satellite technology, and then near-field communication with Bluetooth. Those are the top 3 I would say we can use. But also, too, when the local community sees how important it is, they will push to get these things. It's not important to them now because they live life just fine without it until it becomes a must-need. I think that starts there, and then we have the technology to build from there.
And I would have certainly NFCs. I mean, even in the context of NFC cards. So, we're coming in and we're scanning, our badges, right? That same technology in many ways can be used even in completely, non-internet environments. In environments with no internet, they can still be used. And there's a lot of, clever patterns, that have been developed in other sectors to enable the persistence of transactions, et cetera. And then when internet becomes available, to persist them. But additionally,
and you worked in harsh environments, which you're going to talk about in the panel on disaster response and relief afterwards. Because you're going to talk about what you've been building in places where there's nothing. Right? In terms of internet infrastructure.
Yes, absolutely. And I think another thing is USSD. So USSD is a communications protocol that every telecommunications network in the world supports. It's not something that is typically used in the West, but allows someone to effectively interact with a text-based application that can be supported by the data persisted on that telecommunications network. And the reason why it's important is imagine having a freely accessible digital wallet that you can use on a feature phone or on a smartphone. And that's something that can be globally accessible today. But the issue is that certain telcos allow them, other ones don't. You see actually the most coordination in Africa, right? And that's why you see the persistence of mobile money across communities who otherwise wouldn't have access to any type of financial technologies whatsoever. And so these things, you know, to the earlier point, need to be prioritized, and we can't think of everything in the form of an iOS application.
Well, I want to end on one last question. We are at time, but I want, for all the builders who are out there, and who's actually on this panel, who's joining the Web3athon? You have a team, right? Yes. Okay. So, what is your one advice for builders for like what product or improvement is needed for building generational wealth? Like, what would be your advice be?
Can I add to that? Because that was a challenge around internet, is like we need the right amount of time to talk about the ethical, cultural impacts of all of this before we can even start building. And we need those developers there at the forefront of listening to the community. Because I could talk about being in a hackathon, but I got to go back to my community and say, hey, are you all, you know, like, let's talk about this. What does this mean for ourselves? What does this mean for 7 generations in the future? That's the burden that we have to, that's the burden that I carry, right, about thinking about.
That's why we have 6 weeks for you to submit an idea. You're not forced to build. Yeah. You actually have to understand.
Yeah. Can you ask the question one more time?
What advice do you have for builders who want to work on generational wealth? And I also like lobbed on 2 questions, which is like also around, if there's anything around like digital divide that you want to add, that would be incredible too.
Yeah, so just technical infrastructure in places where they have the digital divide, focus on that, because the world is very large. It's not just New York, LA, and a couple of the big cities. It's a lot of open land that need that infrastructure. So that's an industry within itself. And then the energy industry, focusing on that, being able to use solar power and things like that long term.
Environmental well-being panel.
Oh yeah,
that's right.
You need it. You can get some good carbon credits from that.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say, you know, I mean, learn from your ancestors in terms of the models that already exist. There's very few new things in the world, you know, and it's honestly just taking those models, injecting ethics in terms of the policies that are going to be hard set, and then, you know, going to build. I agree. It's research first, and that's not just research online. That's research on the ground, talking to people in real life. Doing that first. Focus on blockchain later, right? That will find its time within your architecture later on.
On that note, I'm going to wrap this up by saying that's incredible, Robert, that you said focus on blockchain later at a crypto conference and a Web3athon that we're being asked to build on the blockchain. Is one, your advice is focus on the blockchain later. You also said that it's actually incredibly important to do critical stablecoin analysis. If you're going to do anything around that, you have to think about guarantees. And you also gave really great advice about saying, hey, you have to think about USSD as a technology to actually work with. And Isaiah, you really gave great advice on saying meet them where it's at. As a hyperlocal builder, you can be looking at things at gaming. You know, as a high school teacher, you like know what your students need. So meet them where it's at. Don't think that like your passion for gaming is not helpful here. You know, whatever you do, if you're into fashion, if you're into like, you know, understanding like the history of gaming, you belong here. And you also said, you know, I mean, Henry, you also talked about how like we have to avoid the kind of hierarchies that got us into the same problems right here that we're in right now. So with that, this is like a great message to all the builders for the next few weeks, is that you can listen to this panel again, and we're going to have AMAs where we could talk more about the actual practicalities of building around this challenge of generational wealth. Thank you so much, and find them on Twitter and ask them questions.
Thank you so much.
Oh my goodness. Wasn't that an amazing panel? I really loved, what a great tone to set. I think at the beginning, just like, if you have wealth but you can't pass it down, what do you even have? I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind. And just as Trisha was saying, right, these are the people we want to make sure we have in the space. We want to make sure that we have people who are creative in addition to the people who can help build it, and we're all going to end up building it together. I think one thing that's important also that we've talked about is making sure you're making connections and meeting people. An event that's happening after the set of programming at 5 p.m. is we have an after party that CRADL is, that Alio is hosting, one of our sponsors. If you go to bit.ly/CRADL Alio VIP, that should take you to a link where you can register. And if you're unable to find it, just find me after I get off the stage. But the next panel that we have coming up is going to be about financial health. So it's a really wonderful transition from what we were talking about with generational wealth to talking about how we can build financial health today. And the person that we have coming on is Lauren Sirota, and she's very, very special. Okay, I just wanted to make sure everyone's mic'd up. So Lauren is the design director and a co-founder at CRADL. And what makes Lauren so great is she's an incredible product strategist. But for this panel specifically, Lauren spent a pretty significant amount of time rebuilding the financials, or building the financial system in Myanmar and researching how it could serve rice farmers. And one thing she told me that I just thought was super fascinating is that most of the banking system operates on the Gregorian calendar, but farmers operate on monsoon season. They operate relating to the lunar calendar. So if you're talking about building a financial system that works for people, you have to understand how they experience the world before you end up building that. So I'm so excited to welcome Lauren Sirota to the stage.
Thanks, Catherine. You never really know what's going to stick when you tell people things. So I'm glad it was one of those things that was really, really important. And we were so lucky to have that panel on generational wealth just before us. One of the things that they were saying, which I think is a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about today, is that there need to be fundamental shifts in how we think about financial services and how they're implemented. So I'm so excited to be hosting a panel today with 3 people who are doing that, and who are really thinking about the final mile, but also what financial services can and should be in order to actually create financial health globally, not just in communities that have been banked and benefiting from existing financial infrastructure. So I'm going to introduce folks, I guess, one by one as you come out. So I'd like to first introduce Marco Barbosa. Marco, yes, everybody clap for Marco. Welcome, Marco. He's building Impact Market, which is a human empowerment protocol that unlocks access to finance and unconditional basic income, different from universal basic income, which we'll talk about. And he has spent a lot of time in the fundraising space and realized that it was very difficult for people who wanted to give to actually know who they were giving to and give it to the right people who could most benefit from that aid. And so knows this space very well and has been really thoughtful in building Impact Market. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you.
Oluwaseun Adepoju is the head of research for the Africa Blockchain Institute, so coming all the way from Kigali. So thank you so much for making it here, Oluwaseun. He's an extremely important advocate for the innovation ecosystem across the African continent, and publishes is the editor of the Africa Blockchain Report. So I think we actually have a few copies of the Africa Blockchain Report, and we'll talk at a very high level about some of the things he's seeing in places like Uganda and Nigeria and how crypto is making a big difference there. And then finally to the stage, I'd like to welcome Fenny Wong. Fenny Wong, you may know, is the CEO and founder of Humanity Cash. She, and if anybody's familiar with the Berkshires project, anyone? Show of hands. All right, okay, so some Fenny fans in here. Berkshires is a community currency that she's developed and is piloted. And one of the things that I love about what you're doing is that you're also now partnering with MIT to implement a basic income project and also measure the impact, the economic impact of this type of a project long term using a bunch of different indicators. So not just implementing a project, but also saying, let's bring on people to measure how effective it is. So thank you so much for doing that and welcome. I suppose I can sit now. This is what I get for not watching the other panels and how they compose themselves. So Fenny, I would love to start with you. So Berkshires is built around this concept that keeping a currency and kind of value within the community will create better economic outcomes and better financial health for the community. Why is that?
So to explain a little bit about the rationale behind community currencies, they've existed for quite a long time, for over 100 years, and the idea is to keep wealth recirculating locally, especially in the context where when money is so liquid and in a globalized economy, it's so easy for money to leave a community. So we can live in a certain community and have not really deep economic ties to it. We can have a remote job, we could buy everything from Amazon. So the idea of that local currency is to say, well, can we more intentionally direct the money so that we create this multiplier impact? And that's really the key to it. A dollar in a local dollar that goes to support small businesses, for example, can have 3 to 4 times the economic impact. So for $1, you get $3 or $4 worth of economic impact in that local community. With the particular model that we're working on, it is backed by one-on-one backed by federal dollars, held with community banks, and that's really key because the role of a community bank is to take the reserves, your reserves, which are deposits, as loan capital that they're going to use to fund productive activities in that local economy. So community banks in the U.S. are outsized in terms of their contributions for making small business loans, loans to local farms, and also local commercial real estate development. So if you look at the numbers, with the Berkshires, we work with 2 community banks, and for both of these community banks, for every dollar of deposit that you hold with them, 70 cents are going to be invested in that local economy. When you look at Chase Bank, for example, that's the biggest bank in the U.S., for every dollar deposits, only 20 cents is reinvested in the local economy. So there's a huge multiplier impact there in supporting our community banks. And the wonderful thing about a community currency is what we're doing as a community is mutualizing our deposits together and then making exchange amongst each other. And that allows us to not have to withdraw money, our deposits from our community bank, which means our community bank can reinvest that money longer into real projects in our community. So that's the beauty of having that kind of circular economy.
What I think is so interesting about the work that you're doing is you're actually using an existing piece of infrastructure, so community banks and credit unions, as an intermediary. And that is kind of the piece of the legacy system that you see is working because they understand the needs of the community, they're embedded, and ultimately they're reinvesting at a hyperlocal level. And so that's really, I know that we've talked a lot about the theme of the Web3athon as being hyperlocal, but I think all 3 of you think that that's probably the most important thing in creating long-term financial resilience, financial health, right, is understanding the needs at a local level and financial institutions finding ways to support localized needs. So I think that that's a really cool vector and shows this, I think, a very elegant interplay between a decentralized world and an existing incumbent centralized one, which is really rare. As we were talking about, backstage, there's a lot of tension between the new and the old, and even now between the privatized and the public. And so to see this this fantastic opportunity of working together and playing off of each other's strengths, I think that that's really, really powerful. And Marco, I think you share kind of a similar belief in that, having access to finance and keeping it at the community level can kind of provide opportunities to elevate an entire community out of poverty. Can you talk a little bit about specifically how access to finance through something like Impact Market can unlock potentials for communities?
Sure. So I'm not so much on the depth of using existing infrastructure or private sector or whatever, because that has been, there are almost 2 billion people unbanked in the world, and one of the biggest traps or blockers for people that are still living in extreme poverty in very rural areas is because they don't have access to finance. Like, banks and governments just don't care kind of about them, so they don't have access to an infrastructure, they cannot have access to credit or wealth or able to uplift themselves or in an easier way like we do like in a developed country. So somehow like the work we are doing is providing a conditional basic income which you mentioned that is different from universal basic income. And the difference is that universal says that any human being in the world should get access to a level of wealth that puts themselves in a position of above a poverty line or extreme poverty line. Unconditional is a specific part of it that says that whatever money that you receive, you can use it in whatever you want, and it's up to you. It's unconditional. There is no conditions around that. So we work in a lot of, we provide or infrastructure is a DAO that then donors can send money to the DAO. It has a treasury, and then local charities or even community leaders or people that live in refugee camps, resident favelas, local farmers, even indigenous communities that we have, they can apply to receive a basic income, and then define like if it's 20 cents, 30 cents, depending like how much the dollar amount has impact on the local currency. And basically, like most of these people they are unbanked, and even some of them don't have even an ID. So, or they are running away from other country because it's in a very difficult situation. And in our case, basically, we focused on fighting extreme poverty, but at the same time, the same what she was saying about, there is a multiplier effect because you see like the money going in different communities, and then you see the volume and transactions, and it kind of growing with how many addresses they are transacting with, and you see like the volume of transacting only between the beneficiaries usually is 3 to 4 times more than the money they are getting. And even like local merchants and all the other kind of local businesses benefit from that. And this is only possible because of this new technology. And these communities are very grateful, and one of the reasons is that as well, like we are able to go to countries like Togo, Mali, Congo, Myanmar, Yemen, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and others, almost 40 now. And because and the government, some governments are making questions about us, but we say like, okay, good luck with that. This technology can bypass everything. So all the blockers and how, some countries have the dictatorships or, financial system is very fragmented and very, tendentious for some sides. So this way the people have ownership of their money, they have access to a currency that is stronger than the local one, that is dollars, and they are free, and the money is them. No one can take their money away from them, and they can transact it for whatever they believe is important to them. So, because that's another problem, is that sometimes we give money in the developed world to someone, and we think that we know best how they should spend that money. In this case, it's completely different.
Well, it's very hard to track that, right, though? So I think that that's a very naive assumption that, one, I mean, it's an arrogant assumption that anybody knows how someone else should be spending money, and then secondly, naive that we can track how they're spending money. I'm sure that most people in this room know that somebody needs money, they need money for the thing they need money for, and they will borrow it from someone else to make it work. And so you're just creating a problematic cycle, actually, if you're loaning just for a specific thing and trying to monitor that. So it makes sense to be giving people money and then letting them decide what they need it for. There are a couple of mechanisms that I think are really interesting about what you're doing, and one of them, if you could describe kind of really quickly the way that money is administered and the kind of the timing. So it's a combination of kind of the localized administration through the community, which I think is really, you don't have like a country office deciding who gets paid, and it's really done by the community. And then also this mechanism to determine when money gets paid out and how frequently it gets paid out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is kind of 2 main mechanisms. One is on the donor side. So when someone makes a donation, they receive kind of governance tokens. So they become a kind of a shareholder or stakeholders on the protocol itself. So if you compare to the traditional philanthropy, you make a donation after the money goes out of your bank account, you have no idea what happens. In this case, you actually can track and see and you can choose which community you want to support, and also you give governance. And the more it grows, the protocol, you have also like a piece of it, and also that grows as well. So it's a kind of a donation/investment that also gives you also governance that is not possible currently in philanthropy. And in the other side is like, for example, a local charity or community leader can go to our app or website and just fulfill and say, okay, this is how many people we want to reach. This is how much each individual or beneficiary can claim, the amount per claim, what's the minimum time they have to wait between each claim. So let's say 24 hours, let's say like $1, 24 hours. Then what's the maximum amount each individual can claim in total, let's say $300. And then there is a kind of a time dilation or a time increment. That, for example, if it's 5 minutes, what it means is that someone claims, they have to wait at least 24 hours, then claim again at least 24 hours and 5 minutes, then claim again 24 hours and 10 minutes, to claim again 24 hours and 15 minutes. So there's a time dilation. What it means is that after like 1 year, they are claiming like the same amount after each 2 days. So there is, and also it's on demand, so it's not streaming. And then we measure like the average of the time difference between when they can claim and when they actually claim. And the difference in this time over time also help us understand the urgency and the self-sustainability growth of this community.
That's super interesting, and I think it will be interesting to see as time goes on how much flexibility people need in that administration. But it's certainly something that will be cool to watch. Oluwaseun, you've spent a lot of time in discussion with me, and I'm sure in discussion with a lot of people, explaining how the banking system, the banking system, by the way, globally, hasn't really served us. It's a utility, but still people within the banking infrastructure, I think it's only 26% report to be financially healthy. So banks are definitely not the answer, but they certainly aren't the answer in a lot of places where even though people may have a relationship with the bank, they themselves don't benefit from the bank. So can you talk a little bit about the possibility for kind of decentralized currencies in alleviating some of these problems?
Yeah, thank you very much. When we talk about the potentials of the blockchain technology itself with the cryptocurrency use case, we usually don't pay attention to the data that speaks to the vulnerables and the people that are living in rural areas. And like I said yesterday on the panel I participated in, we read this data all the time, that we have 400 million unbanked people in Africa, for example. And we keep creating solutions that does not speak to solving that problem, with our fintechs and all these financial solutions we are providing. So I think the promise of crypto is freedom, and we must connect that freedom to the people that need it most. So I'll speak first of all for, I've worked a little bit with refugees, and I have a number of refugees as friends. And these are guys who have families. Most of them have kids back home. And because of the inconsistent, immigration issues they've had, because of a lot of issues with their identity, they are usually not given opportunity in the traditional banking system, which is not supposed to be. Most countries will not tell you that they have stigma for these people, but the truth is they still go through the stigma, right? And I was speaking to a friend who has been a refugee for almost 9 years in the location where I currently work from, and whenever I want to send money home, I would give the money to a friend that is in that country. Then the friend will go to the bank for him and send the money to his wife in his country, and the money usually takes like 7 days to arrive.
Extremely efficient.
Yes. Then he discovered crypto, right? And he could manage his own crypto wallet, send it, then taught his wife how to receive the money on the other hand. And in less than 24 hours, they could do peer-to-peer at the location, and the lady is able to pay for the school fee of the children and take care of the house, right? So another situation is around refugee entrepreneurship. Right? A lot of startups, I've read about 3 startups who are developing a system where you do not need a lot of KYC and identification before you're able to borrow money as a refugee to do business. And when you look at places like South Sudan, Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, they have this big community of refugees who are structured in such a way that they're able to do business by themselves. And there's also a company in Rwanda called Inkomoko. They were acquired by a company called Africa Entrepreneurship Collective recently, and they give small loans via digital asset and platforms to refugees to do businesses, and they have 90% loan return rate. That tells you that something is there as a business model for blockchain and crypto solutions.
And these are to people that would otherwise not be able to have access to a formal financial instrument.
Yes, yes. And also, when people also come together, a lot of farmers cooperatives work in Africa, and they're able to also, go to, the strength of farmers cooperative is becoming so much that they can actually determine what they want and make statements to the traditional banks on demands of what they want. But on the business side, I think there's a lot of opportunity for crypto, for farmers cooperatives, refugee entrepreneurships, and also remittances, international remittances for refugees, basically. And other use cases would be around tokenization of value, because when you look at the problems that will face in the society society, they are so enormous that we can look at the problems we can bundle into one solution, and also look at the ones we can address one by one, right? So there's something in the grassroots that we are not paying attention to, and we attend international conferences, speak on big platforms, and we talk about these big statistics that we are not paying attention to and not doing anything about. And it seems we are majoring on the minor and minoring on the major when it comes to financial inclusion. And I think crypto promises a big impact for the downtrodden, for the people we usually don't talk about, and for the vulnerables. The last example I would give, I visited Namibia recently, and I stayed in the Airbnb of a particular guy who is into property investment, and he told us that when there was this financial crisis in Namibia, and he had properties for elites and also had properties in the slums. He told us that for 6 months, those bank managers and professionals who are living in his house in the city could not pay the rent. But those guys in the slums never missed paying their rent because they figured out how to maintain their financial fortunes as small as it is. And the multiplication of that can give us insights into the kind of business models we can take there as digital asset managers or crypto solutions. So there's a lot of opportunity there, I believe.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about creditworthiness specifically, and credit scoring being in a lot of places the key mechanism to allow people to access credit unconditionally, so without the approval of their co-op, for things that they need to grow their business. And so I would imagine that there's a big tie into this when you realize that there is creditworthiness because you finally are giving people money and being able to prove that out.
Yeah.
So that's a really excellent example. I actually have a question, Fenny, for that, because you were talking about credit and lending within local communities administered by these community banks and federal credit unions or local credit unions. Do you see similar things happening? Like, do you see things where there's a transition of the community financing model into like credit scoring, or how do you see those things interplaying with each other?
The strength of community banks is relationship banking. So when you look at what happened during the pandemic, in the US, there was a federal program called the Paycheck Protection Program, and community banks were instrumental in administering PPP loans quickly because they had those relationships and they understood that the businesses were coming to them were not fraudulent. So when you look at the volume of PPP loans issued, 85% of that was issued by small banks, community banks with less than $1 billion in assets. So they were highly critical in ensuring that kind of critical liquidity went to those local businesses because those relationships were in place. The other thing that I think is interesting as we think about digital money, as I said before, we're mutualizing our deposits together as a community, and therefore, couldn't the stablecoin, right, that local stablecoin itself be structured as some kind of Web3, whatever you want to call it, but a cooperative bank, right? Those models have existed for hundreds of years. So, for example, Lee Bank, which is one of the reserve banks for Berkshires, is a mutual bank. It does not have any shareholders, so it is owned by its depositors. It has been around since 1850. So it has survived a lot in U.S. history, from the Civil War to, countless wars and all this massive social, political, technological change, and it still thrives because it has that kind of responsibility and ownership by its very members and depositors. And can we compound those kind of models, right? Because mutual banks have been disappearing in America. They've been demutualizing with shareholders. And so we have an opportunity, again, to rethink those models. If the future of money is going to be tokenized deposits or stable coins or these types of flavors, the depositors should be owners of that mechanism and say, hey bank, we would like you, since this is our money, we would like you to ensure that there's more financial inclusion. Why aren't you lending more to minority-owned businesses? Why aren't you lending more to fund community-based, for example, solar projects and other critical infrastructure that we need to be more self-sufficient and economically self-reliant, support local supply chains, food security, and so forth. So that's really the goal towards how we can use also the power of our deposits towards governance.
I'm so happy that you brought up PPP, because why not? And that was an example of something where that was corrected. There was, the administration of the first round, if anyone, who here got a PPP loan? Okay, so you had a tough couple of years. Thanks for keeping people employed and working your butts off. So people who got PPP loans, which were a lot of people in specific industries, the first time it was tough because most of it went to big banks, and a lot of small local businesses are banking with community banks and credit unions. And so they corrected that the second time, right? Because they realized the money was not going to the people who needed it most, and so they redistributed the second round of PPP to make sure it was going to the right financial intermediaries. But that's a very kind of common pattern of making decisions on high, distributing it through kind of large entities and not recognizing what is actually required and how much you need to know about the communities that you're trying to reach, and who you should be working with and distributing through in order to reach them most effectively. And so I think one of the things that's very exciting about what each of you was talking about is like that there is work being done in this space. There's huge potential for this technology to be leveraged in a new way to kind of create a lot more agency for people on the ground, for communities to manage their own financial health and well-being, which is just fantastic news. I think for all of us who've worked in finance for quite some time, and it's felt relatively hopeless, and we've seen waves of fintech and a lot of promise of inclusion and all of these things, and things tend to get re-centralized, and it's the same people making decisions. So this is a refreshing kind of change of course. We're out of time. I'm going to do a quick lightning round. Okay, thanks. Brandon's giving me a head nod. That's okay. What's one word to summarize this particular moment for financial health and well-being?
I feel is an incredible white space, and if we can cultivate that would be, instead of getting bogged down towards politics, but there's an openness, an invitation to work together. So that's what I feel.
Thanks, Benny.
For me, I would say we need to make true the slogan: competition is cooperation is the new competition, for all the active players and stakeholders in the financial ecosystem. None of us should feel like we are the only savior of the ecosystem and the solutions we're trying to provide. I think when we're able to come together, we would accelerate our financial health.
Excellent, thank you.
One word, I will say disruption, but like is too wide. I will say borderless. And I think that's specifically in a technology perspective, I think it's the first time that actually a technology like is borderless, like borderless in all the sense, in a society, in country, in all the ways that we put barriers for different kinds of access to different kind of resources. This technology actually doesn't care about where you live or the coordinates that you're born in, and you have access to it and you have ownership of it. So I think that I love technology, and I think that I'm very happy that this technology exists, because finally we can bypass all those kind of barriers and problems and borders. So I would say borderless.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marco. And thanks, y'all, for being here and for sharing with us. Thanks, y'all, for sticking around. I think, Catherine, you're going to introduce the next people. We'll let Catherine back up on stage. Can we get a round of applause for Catherine, by the way? She's holding it together.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thanks to those amazing panelists. It's so amazing to see the set of programming that we have on stage today, and the fact that it's so reflective of the fact that we have people all over the world watching, people from all over the world at this conference today, and ideally, people from all over the world participating in Web3athon. One thing that really struck me about that panel, though, was how a real awareness of the financial system kind of seems to be a prerequisite to being able to build in it. But one thing that doing this work has taught me is that all of you have a perspective on the financial system. If you have a bank account and you've been to an ATM and you're like, gosh, why is this so hard? That's a perspective. Or if you don't have a bank account, why not? What's been hard about it? Why is the spam I get from all these credit card companies in the mail so freaking confusing? So any expertise, any perspective you have is just a justifiable way to get into the space and a way you can bring and build something in Web3 that's truly amazing. We have another panel coming up after this. We're going to take a quick second if all the are the chairs good? All right. We're good. We're all good then. So we're going to go ahead and welcome our next panel to the stage. This next panel, all of these panels, just really quickly to set expectations, are for the Web3athon Hackathon, which is a hyperlocal, people-first crypto hackathon. All of these themes are the challenges we're posing to our attendees to think about, what do you want to do to make your community better? And so this next panel is really exciting about that because it's on sustainable community and culture. And I absolutely adore the moderator for this panel, who is Trisha Wong, the co-founder and director of CRADL. And Trisha is an amazing tech ethnographer. Her experience in tech spans many, many years and started with the first text messaging technology all the way to understanding data privacy in Web 2. But what I love most about Trisha is, as I've become her friend, is she's a really active participant in all of the communities she's a part of. She really lives where she is. She knows the names of everyone who lives on her block. And one thing Trisha does for fun that not many people know is she's a salsa dancer. And most people I know who have hobbies are like, oh, it's just this thing I do for fun. But what Trisha told me when she told me she did salsa is that salsa is like dancing through history. Because if you look at the influence of drums in salsa, it comes from the fact that salsa traveled through the Americas and was influenced by African slaves and the use of drums they have. And I think it's just such a great example of how your life can be so much richer when you have an understanding of the culture of the things that you're doing. And also, how much better the tech we can have is going to be when we have that understanding how culture is worth preserving. So let's welcome Trisha Wong to the stage so she can introduce the rest of our panelists.
Thank you, Catherine. I did not know you're going to bring up the salsa thing, but that makes me very happy because that's the whole point of this Web3athon, is that we have amazing panelists who are real human beings and have real interests that they're bringing over to Web3. So I'm going to bring up Kevin. Kevin Seo is, Lauren Sirota really found them here and, at South by Southwest in Austin, but Kevin is a restaurateur, and you created the first NFT restaurant, Bored and
Hungry.
I'm sorry, I can't even read my own handwriting. You're also the co-founder of the first NFT group. And then we have Jordan Cooley. And recently, Jordan is a CRADL researcher. She's been, researching City and Coins, which she's going to talk about. But one of the reasons why we hired Jordan was, even though she's got this intense policy background and she does, criminal justice and juvenile justice system, is that we found out that she also was a bartender and that she was actively working as a waitress. And then she also does organizes poetry slams. And we were like, that's a real human being. That's someone who can actually work and relate to people and make people understand Web3. And then we have Gary Sheng out here coming up of DreamDAO, Chief Innovation Officer. And Gary actually started out as a programmer at Google. And then he realized maybe my life needs more meaning. And he just kind of quit. And he says this on his website. I'm not making this up. It's not private conversation or anything. And he then was like, maybe I should give back to society. Not that you're not giving back if you're a Google program, but you personally felt like you needed to do more. And so then you went on to work with Civics Unplugged, and your work is to train civic leaders all around the world. So we'll be talking about that more. And then last and finally, we have David Casey, who I was so excited to meet David backstage for the first time, because all of your work is I love that you put that you were an organizer in your bio, that you organize social movements. And that's been a part of your work all your career. And so we're going to hear about what you're actually building, because you have done so much and so much through the Web3 space. And we're going to hear about what it means to not to be an issuer of stable coins, but to be an issuer of stable credit. Right? Stable, is that right? Am I saying right? Okay, I want to make sure I understand that. And what I also loved about that is you're doing what you call a full stack monetary toolkit. And you also live in Berkeley in California. So California vibes up for all of those who are watching out in the audience. So here we're talking about sustainable culture and communities. And this is one of the third challenges of our Web3athon with the theme of hyperlocal. The reason why we chose these speakers to come up is that one of the most critical issues of our time is how do we actually make sure that communities have a way to be resilient, who can thrive without being dependent on hierarchical institutions that have typically controlled access to resources, be it currency, be it money, be it land. And so while what we're here for is actually to talk about, well, what are you actually doing in your community that's different? So that all the builders out there, so you can feel confident, all of you come from somewhere, all of you live somewhere, all of you know your community somehow. And all of that knowledge can come to use. Whatever you're doing here, you can actually bring to the Web3athon. And I think these four people really, really bring that example out. Now, I want to actually start with David right now, because you are a builder, tried and true, and I really want to hear from you. What are you building that's actually going to enable communities to be sustainable and to sustain their culture?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this beautiful gathering. Yeah, so we're building something called the Resource Protocol, and in one sense it's really simple. What we're doing is bringing a monetary system that's in some measurements 40,000 years old, barter, on chain. And this is something that we've all done, probably. Has anyone here bartered before, traded things without money? Cool, okay. So what we're doing is bringing that activity on chain and allowing you to trade within your network or community. So it's
Why do we need a chain for that, though? Because I can trade right now.
So I have a story. Some Lebanese business community approached us, and we said the same thing. There's barter networks. Mutual credit is the name of the system, or barter. And these networks exist all around the world in Web 2. And we said, look, there's Web 2 barter software. It's going to take us a while to build. Why don't you just use that? And they're like, David, I don't know if you know what we're going through right now in Lebanon with the hyperinflation, but we're never trusting a centralized institution again to manage our monetary system. The only way we're going to do it is a decentralized public network that we can really trust.
So when you hear this, I'm curious, Jordan, you study city coins, and they say the same words as David, which is we're decentralized and we're not relying on systems. But tell us what city coins is, and because it sounds like it should benefit people who live in cities. What are you seeing?
It's been a lot of reading through the Discord to kind of read between the lines. It's been
what is city coins?
Yes,
kind of frame it up for us.
It's they're essentially trying to introduce a new financing structure into cities, right? They believe that there isn't a lot of agency within residents to be able to decide where funding is allocated, and so city coins is trying to offer an on-chain solution where they put in stacks, they get city coins out, that stacks is then redistributed to people within the ecosystem who are staking on-chain.
So their currency is called stacks.
Their currency is called stacks, so it's an anchor cryptocurrency. You get city tokens out from the smart contracts. But whenever you put the stacks into it, right, 30% is sent into the city, similar to a tax. 70% is then redistributed to people who are staking, or what they call stacking on their chain.
Okay, so it sounds like everyone should benefit. What are you actually seeing then? Is it actually helping sustaining culture and communities?
From what I've seen, no. A lot of what they're doing is kind of just replicating the current model. They're not looking at hyperlocality. They haven't researched economic or community development models. A lot of what they're doing is mirroring actually the 1970s, 1980s economic development, and we've seen what happens in that regard. Tricia, you did a great, I think, opening yesterday for the Web3athon, showing how highways segregated cities. We talked about it this morning at the panel on the main stage. And what they're doing is not doing the due diligence to understand what infrastructure, whenever it's built, how it's actually going to impact people, specifically people of color and communities of color.
I'm curious, David, before I hop to Kevin and Gary, but as someone who's building something actually supposed to solve for sustaining culture and communities, what are your thoughts on how is what you're building different than city coins? Because it could be similar to someone who's just sitting in the audience and hearing all of this for the first time.
Yeah, so I don't know too much about city coins, but what we are doing is building financial infrastructure, open source infrastructure that any community can take customized to meet the needs of their own community. And rather than the city issuing credit from the kind of like top down, each person, each merchant, each freelancer can issue credit. So it's like actually decentralizing the issuance of credit itself.
It actually sounds like what, Jordan, you're looking at is very like top-down centralization efforts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they like to say that it's for the people, but it's really for the token holders who are already in city coins. But a lot of them aren't living in New York or Miami or even Austin where they're trying to launch coins or have launched coins.
Okay, it doesn't sound like it's like hyper-local. That's like pretty simple.
Yeah.
I mean, and so talking about like, Kevin, what is it that you're doing? Because the reason why, you know, when Lauren came back and she said she met you, she's like, wow, I met this group where they've been able to raise money but not depend on a top-down issuer. In this case would be a bank when you're trying to start something, right? Like, what are you doing that is so different and new?
Yeah, so she says really nice things about us because we fed her, so she's extremely excited.
What did you feed her?
What we did was before, Food Fighters Universe is the first NFT-backed restaurant group. So instead of going through traditional funding and creating different food concepts, we decided, why not let the people fund us and just try something a little bit different with shared utilities and different types of perks along the way, because we've been in the food industry for a little bit of time, and what a lot of people don't know is in the food space, there's a lot of activities, events, community activations that's all involved. So then people are always asking us, how do we get the inside track to these events? How can we get more involved? How do we eat more of your food? So because of that kind of sparked the idea. But before doing our own project, we wanted to give back to the existing communities out there, and we used a very well-known, one of the first utility or heavy utility NFT collections was Bored Ape Yacht Club. And so that's where we built Bored and Hungry, which is, we utilized our ape 6184, and we utilized our ape to create our restaurant, and it created a lot of buzz, and luckily, and we know that everybody really loved our food too.
For those who just don't know what an ape 6184, like specifically 6184, but also apes in general, can you just break it down really quickly?
Yeah.
Like, what are we talking about?
Sorry, yeah.
NFTs?
Yeah, so if you guys have seen in the media or Web 2 media, Web 3 media, you see a bunch of pictures of apes everywhere. That's Bored Ape Yacht Club. The reason why we chose this NFT collection to create our food brand around, at least for the first concept, is it's almost like the current universal language of, oh, I kind of know what that is. That's an NFT, right? So a lot of people see this image now and starting to become part of pop culture. And the reason why it blew up so quickly is because it was one of the first NFT collections that gave you utility. And one of the big utility pieces is utilizing the IP for free if you purchase the NFT, and that's what we did.
That's incredible. So in terms of just community activation, it's just so crazy that as a restaurant, like someone who actually makes food, first of all, your food must be good, and that's why you raised that much money,
yes.
Right? Okay, really good. Like, I don't know yet because I haven't been fed yet, but Lauren verifies, and I trust her, taste. So, but what would you recommend to the builders out there if they love cooking? Like, how did you bridge from cooking to Web3 NFTs? Like, how does that jump even work?
Yeah, so a lot of it, honestly, it comes from, I talk about this a lot, restaurateurs and people that enjoy food. Am I going in and out of the mic, by the way? It's like,
I think.
Oh, it's okay. Oh yeah, it's just me? Okay, just by myself. Okay, cool. Okay.
Talking.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So, when it comes to restaurateurs, we're all a special breed of crazy. And the reason why I say that, a restaurant business fails 50% of the time in year one. Year two, you're gonna fail 70% of the time. Take that crazy energy that you guys are already risk takers and do your own research and learn something new. And for us, when we saw this innovative space, we didn't want to just sit back in the audience. We wanted to participate. We wanted to make a ton of mistakes. And we made a ton of mistakes. You guys are seeing some of the successes of what we've done, but man, like even purchasing the ape was insane. Like it took us a long time to do it. And then on top of that, we got our NFTs like stolen. Like it was crazy.
What? How much did it cost, the ape?
The ape itself cost us in USD, you guys are going to think we're nuts, but it was $267,000.
And how did you get that money together?
So for us, we pitched this crazy idea to a bunch of good people in our network, and they went along with us, and that's how we got into the first board in Hungary. Yeah.
Amazing. How, David, with building your protocol out, how would something like what you're building actually, like how would someone like Kevin, a restaurateur in a system?
Yes, please tell me.
Like how would he be using what you're doing? Because it sounds like there would be that, like there's a natural kind of alignment here.
Absolutely. So yeah, the first go-to-market, we're actually going for local food supply chains, local organic food producers. And so restaurants can use interest-free credit lines. Barter is basically interest-free credit because there's no banks to charge interest. It's just peer-to-peer in the form of resources, products and services. So you guys could get a credit line at 0 interest, spend it on ingredients, and then you pay back the network when customers come to you and buy from you.
So this conversation wasn't pre-discussed. So I'm sitting here like learning this for the first time. I'm like, what? Okay.
I mean, and Gary, so I actually wanted to ask you, I purposely am like asking you last because you are training the future builders of Web3 and the future civic leaders so that we can actually have sustainable culture and communities. Like when we first talked, you were like, this is exactly what I'm doing. And so from your perspective, like what, can you explain to the audience first, what are you doing? And two, like what's going to happen if your DAO is successful? What are we going to see? You know, what's going to change for everyone here?
It's a great question. And I first wanted to say, like, the CRADL team is doing such a great job. Like, I put on a lot of events in my life, and like, the fact that you put this together in 8 weeks or something like that is just, it's absolutely mind-blowing. And also, just want to shout you out for having the, like, DreamDAO was not planning to go to consensus, and your team reached out and said that we understand your mission, and Web3 will not realize its potential if your group is not here, right?
And you're here, right? Yeah. Where's the DreamDAO team here? Yay!
Right.
Woo! You're all joining Web3athon.
But so what we do is we're creating this missing on-ramp for impact-oriented, not necessarily technical, diverse, 15 to 20-year-olds that want to make leverage Web3 to do good in the world. And I think like all the older people are still figuring out how to do that. And speaking of like sustainability, I think like let's talk in like 5 years to know what ideas actually ended up lasting. But we're in this kind of beautiful experimentation stage where I'm personally very excited about the fact that we are placing 12 of our young members in meaningful internships at Regen Network, Cello, Gitcoin, Refi DAO. Like, organizations I personally also didn't know just a few months ago.
Said all my friends' names.
I know, right? Great people. But what success looks like is, I think hyperlocal is a meme that I think is going to take the world by storm in a really good way, because I think we've outsourced our like health, wellness, happiness to these kind of faceless or well, basically these faceless corporations, like our
like the one who employed you.
So I wanted to joke that, you know, when you want to break up the company that you're getting paid by, it's probably a good time to leave. So I worked at Google. And so I think I've been thinking about decentralization for a while, but what I didn't think a lot about was regen. I didn't think a lot about hyperlocal until I met so many of these amazing people like Gregory in the back who have been doing the work. And so I'm like a kind of glorified hype man for different young people, for different organizations. I'm just like connecting dots, and thank you for being the hype man of our organization. Hype person.
Gender neutral.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, Gary, can you give a specific, concrete, like, example of what do you mean? Because you really hooked me when you were like, we are training the future civic leaders who can actually be proponents of democracy, not democracy, but democratic forms of governance. So what exactly are you doing to train these local leaders in different parts of the world? And how are you doing it through a DAO? Why do we need a DAO for that?
So we're super early, just like a lot of DAOs in the space and organizations. But one of the less spoken about benefits of all this talk about DAOs is it's sort of sparking it's helping spark a missing, like the civic renaissance that it has the potential to help spark the civic renaissance that we badly need, which is the civic spirit, the desire to contribute to local communities or just small communities that could be globally distributed. But like, we had at Civics Unplugged, we had the decision to either teach Web3 by recommending a bunch of like lectures and whatnot, or help them learn how to contribute to Web3 by building the machine that is empowering them, right? So our young members are called builders because they're actually building the DAO that is helping them secure opportunities to become greater and greater contributors to Web3 in the world. And just in terms of examples of hyperlocal impact, I think it's super early, and we know that we need to, we want to support hyperlocal initiatives that already exist by matching our young members with them. But we also, we're in talks with, for example, I'm personally in talks with Chance the Rapper's team in Chicago, who've been working with local high schools and teenagers for years. And they are so excited about this idea of potentially creating block clubs, which it sounds like it was intentionally made by Web3 people, but it's just like neighborhood people supporting their neighborhood, right? And to whatever extent Web3 can be useful for that, that's an open question. But let's channel some of all the attention and energy and capital that we're generating here to help the most marginalized people elevate.
So what does a DAO have to do with this, though? I still actually don't totally get it, because I'm like, it sounds like you can train a bunch of young people to do this. Why do we need a DAO? Sounds a bit complex. Like, what does a DAO actually do, the DAO governance infrastructure? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So part of why the DAO movement is sparking a civic renaissance is because who was talking about governance proposals before Web3? It's actually amazing. It's like, it's making some of the most like otherwise boring stuff sexy, right? And we have to like really appreciate that. I don't know how much.
I think people were talking about governance. Actually, I would push back. It's like participatory budgeting. I mean, we have so many examples of people who have talked about governance. But what is it about DAOs that like are different now? Because there's something unique, but I'm really trying to pull it out of you.
I appreciate you pulling here. So when for DAOs, it's kind of like at least for Dream DAO, we're seeing it sort of like a training ground for young people to develop these civic aptitudes that can then be applied to much trickier environments, right? New York City, Chicago, these are very politically challenging environments to try to change, right? Even in the smallest aspect, right? So you develop agency through safe, almost like training grounds, but it's not academic exercise, right? The proposals, for example, to decide which conferences our young members get to fly to next, like that actually that goes from idea to then discussion, refinement, and then actually action and deployment of funds, right? This is the exact same process that you theoretically go through in any sort of more local democracy. And I think it's beautiful that through Web3 they might have the opportunity to develop the skills that might make them really effective local city council people.
So it's actually transparent, the deployment of funds.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with you, right? In so much that like this new technology, yes, participatory budgeting has been around for a long time. You've seen it in Chicago, actually. But there's this idea, I mean, we see it, there's a reason why a lot of politicians are like, go out and vote. We need young people to vote. And we had the most young people vote in the 2020 election. But there's a lot of disillusionment in like local government and state government and federal government, and giving people the tools and teaching them the technology which may run the government, which may run financial services in a way that they're like, oh, I am starting in at the ground floor in a DAO, right? Using the technology to not only figure out how to move proposals, but how to organize themselves. I see a great, potential in that. That seems phenomenal.
I mean, it sounds like community activation, which is, Kevin, something you talk a lot about. And I'm curious, like, why would a restaurateur, why would you talk about community action when like people are like, oh, that's just food, it's just like a place? How does that have anything to do with like sustainable culture and communities?
Yeah, so even before the NFT space, one of our partners, Andy Wynn, he's not here due to some family stuff, but he's not here. So our partner, for 8.5 years, he came from actually the streetwear industry. And so he really understood what culture and lifestyle and community could really do for a brand. And he took that same mindset and brought it to food. We partnered with him later on, and he's been able to do some amazing things with some of his brands. Like, for example, when you marry delicious desserts and Hello Kitty, you're going to have lines out the door. Just imagine that. I'm sure many of you would love to check that out and taste what that purple pink drink would be with a Hello Kitty cover on it. I mean, because you're activating two communities, and it's super Instagrammable, yeah. And then, so that's just an example what we've been able to do with brands in food, right? Where like BMW wanted to have a cafe in downtown, so we converted our cafe in downtown to a BMW cafe.
How does that actually benefit communities? With what you're doing, especially by involving NFTs?
So where the NFT part came in for us is that the last few years it's been pretty devastating in our industry. There's been a lot of more despair than anything with a lot of the restaurateurs and a lot of our peers in the industry. And every time we were because we do like monthly meetups and networking with other entrepreneurs in the food space, and it's a lot of like complaints and sadness and, oh man, nobody wants to work here anymore and whatnot. And we wanted to encourage them by showing that, hey, we're doing something innovative and still exciting, something new to bring eyes back into the kitchen, back into what we do. So when we're talking about retention, how do we get new people to innovate and stay excited about the food industry? We have to stay innovative and excited, and that's kind of what we did.
One example that you've been innovative, because I would love for you to share up this quickly, this product idea that has come out, because this example for builders out here of where you can be doing something and you're like, oh, if this product doesn't exist, I can make it.
So we had to I'll go really, really fast. So in Bored and Hungry, because it was based on Bored Ape Yacht Club, they released their own currency, ApeCoin. They did it literally when we announced when the restaurant would open. So the internet went crazy and asked us if we're going to accept ApeCoin. So nobody out there was able to process this as a payment for food. So we just got together, our devs went crazy, and we made a POS system overnight. And it was absolutely insane. And we took ApeCoin that day, and the whole community exploded.
I want you to hear this, because this is a perfect example where the idea did not come from the devs. I mean, they may have been on your team, but it came from you being in the food industry and hearing that there was a need, and then coming up with a product, right? But you were listening first, and then you went into build. And so I would love to end on just like a quick, what's the one piece of advice that everyone has before you get off on stage for all the builders out there? Like, for how you ended up here? Like, what's the one piece of advice that you have?
So I'll start. I think a big part of life is following your passions and following things that you believe have purpose and meaning to you. And if you end up in that place, you're going to be solving problems for a lot of other people and having fun doing it.
Community is nuanced. You're not going to be able to know everything about everyone who is there. What you can do is be adaptive, flexible, you can listen. And I think it's really important to do the due diligence and the work, but also don't stress out, don't be anxious at like, oh, I'm not going to be knowledgeable enough about it. But you can be open enough about it.
Kevin, and then Gary, then we're gonna go.
My mind is completely blank, but please be in a brand new, going into any brand new industry is scary, but just like how you did before, take the risk and take the chance.
I think number one, it's being grateful for every opportunity that you get. It's awesome that I get to represent DreamDAO on the stage. I'm grateful to know you, and I think that if you count your blessings every day, you will likely have more blessings in the future.
Well, I think the takeaway is that you hear from all these, everyone here, is that to be humble, and especially for the builders, is experiment. All of these people have been experimenting and failing. You know, they've been failing for so long, starting different companies and then succeeding in different ways. Like, we're all experimenting here. And so that's really why we have this Web3athon, is for you to experiment and to fail together and to learn together, and most importantly, to listen together. So thank you so much. We can't wait to get you to submit your challenges.
Oh my goodness, what an amazing panel.
Do we bow?
Come on down. Yeah. There were so many incredible speakers on stage just now, and I think it's really wonderful to have that sort of energy. And there are two things that really sort of stuck out to me from that panel. The first was what Trisha said about failing. And I think that like a cliche that we kind of hear is like failing up, but you don't need to think about each project and the status of each project. Like once it closes, oh, that's a failure. And it's not just about what you learn. If you think of each micro opportunity, each decision you make when you're working on these projects, I promise your first smart contract that you build is probably not going to work. Like, I can pretty much guarantee it, but you have to debug it. I think one thing that we can all actually learn from software engineering is that you have to try things in order to figure out what works and what doesn't. I mean, prototyping and building, that's the whole spirit of hackathons, is to put yourself out there and start building. One thing Kevin had said that I think really resonated with that was that he's sitting here learning things for the first time. And I don't think any of you would disagree with me that Kevin's doing the damn thing. Like, the fact that everyone that you look up to in this space is doing this for the first time. Web3 is doing this for the first time. And the last thing I really liked was when Trisha had that exchange with DreamDAO, really trying to understand and be thoughtful about why are we using Web3 for this? Why are DAOs the thing that we need to make this happen? And so I wanted to mention briefly that at the end of today, we'll be joined by Dave Lewis, who's watching on the stream. He's such a personality. He's an up-and-coming thought leader, I guarantee it, in the space, where we're going to have a really thoughtful conversation about what we learned in the panels today that are about Web3athon's 5 hyperlocal challenge areas. On that note, I'm so excited to talk about our next panel, which is on environmental well-being. And this is a really important conversation to have if we're talking about blockchain, right? No one here is disagreeing that blockchain is something we have to think about when it comes to climate change and when it comes to making a difference in the environment. And it also underpins everything we're doing. It's the prerequisite to having financial health, to having sustainable cultures and community. If we're not able to thrive in the environment we live in, it's kind of a non-starter. The moderator we have for this today is the wonderful Lauren Sirota. She is the director, or the design director and a co-founder of CRADL, and a brilliant product strategist. But when she's not doing amazing design research, she's also advising a company called Funga. And she's super smart on it, but my gist of it is that if you take technology and you add mushrooms, you have a better way to grow trees, which is a better way to capture carbon. If you're coming to our Alio after party at 5 p.m., the best way to get Lauren to talk to you is to ask her about her mushrooms. But Lauren is so in touch with the importance of environmental well-being, and she's so personally invested in making a difference in this space. I'm so excited to hear the conversation she's going to have with our amazing panelists. Let's welcome Lauren to the stage.
Oh, I think I'm on. Hey, thanks. Specifically mycelium, okay? So if you want to talk about microdosing, we can do that too, but I'll know a little bit less. I just want to make sure everybody's clear. And so I've been paying attention to the climate space for quite some time, and I think a lot of people pay attention to the climate space and blockchain in terms of the environmental impact of mining. But really what we're here to talk about today is the significant potential of blockchain technologies to enable us to stay on the planet, to better monitor our air quality, to better provide access to water, so to actually make life much healthier and better for everybody on Earth. And so I'm really excited to welcome my panelists today, who are each going to talk about what they're doing in a completely different way. So come on up, y'all. We can introduce ourselves while you're sitting down. Can I get a round of applause for these folks? Okay, so I'd first like to introduce, it's like a surprise in terms of what order you're sitting in. Claudio Perinello, who is a former research physicist, but does one ever stop becoming a research physicist?
I stopped at the turn of the last century. a long time ago.
I'm sure that you still have some of those tendencies, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and has worked, spent quite a bit of time at CERN, but is now the founder and CEO of PlanetWatch. Can you talk a little bit about PlanetWatch?
Sure. Okay, PlanetWatch, so the link with CERN, the logical link, the easiest one to explain, is related to the notion of citizen science. Citizen science was big at CERN at some point. It's the idea that unskilled, ordinary people can add real value to scientific projects. There have been lots of projects displaying this in the last 20 years. When I was at CERN, I realized it was a great idea, but there was something missing in the picture. We missed scalability, transparency, and global engagement. So at some point I felt that citizen science plus blockchain technology would do the trick. So the idea of PlanetWatch is citizen science applied to a huge environmental challenge, which is air quality monitoring worldwide. So the challenge is you need dense hyperlocal sensor networks anywhere in the world, especially in inner cities, and you need to be able to deploy in a fast and cost-effective manner. Solution, incentivize and engage local residents to help you deploy the network and generate the big data we need to monitor our environment. That's what
Thank you. Yeah, that's super important and a perfect segue actually to Charlene. And Charlene, by the way, is extremely brave because she is not coming from the Web3 world, but she's coming from a deep expertise in water access, watershed protection. So thank you for coming here and starting to imagine how Web3 technologies can actually impact the space. Can you talk a little bit about your organization and what you do?
Sure. So we launched Texas Water Trade. We're a 501c3 charitable organization working statewide since 2019 to try to solve the problem of having explosive population growth in a state that has declining water availability, and trying to meet the need of our human population over time, but also make sure that we don't strand the habitats and ecosystems that provide quality of life and life for all sorts of amazing wildlife that share the state with us. So really what we try to do is buy water and enable water through business however we can, whether that's buying water rights, much like you might buy land for protection of ecosystems, but also looking at the human dimension and realizing that there's no way to ever solve the problem. You'll never have enough money. There will never be enough water available to buy on the market to solve the wildlife water problem if you don't change the way that people in Texas source their water. And so I'm really happy to be here learning about Web3 and thinking about what it means for the really innovative ways that we're trying to fundamentally shift from cities and growing populations being a demand for water to being a supply of water. And we can talk more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I've been learning some really mind-boggling stuff, like totally revolutionary stuff about air conditioning condensate, which we'll get to in a little bit if anybody gets really nerdy about kind of new sources of really valuable resources. Charlene's got some cool information on that. John Ruth, who, by the way, the coolest stat, over your career, you've built over 400 megawatts of solar projects, which is just super cool. So experienced solar project developer, but now you founded Spark Eco, which is a DAO to provide access to renewable energy infrastructure, specifically solar. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm building Spark Eco, and at the highest level, we realize that there's 1 billion people on Earth that don't have access to electricity. And so if we are going to provide 1 billion people with electricity at this point, we have to provide them with clean, renewable energy. And so at the highest level, we want to develop new systems of funding and financing solar so that we can bring solar energy to all of those people. Specifically, we are working on models to fund solar as well as looking at the renewable energy certificates, which are associated with renewables and solar energy, and trying to bring those on to the blockchain as a new money Lego so that we can develop new subsidies to make those projects happen.
I sense a theme of hyperlocal and accessible infrastructure happening at the citizen level, which I think is really, really important and powerful. And then finally, Gregory Landaway, who is the founder of Regen Network and the ReFi movement, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room are familiar with, and if not, you should be. You should be paying attention to what's going on in the space, bringing carbon markets on chain, and resolving some of the kind of issues that exist in the legacy carbon market. Can you tell us a little bit about what Regen Network is doing?
Yeah, well, so what Regen Network is doing, I think actually kind of goes a little bit deeper than the carbon market as it currently exists. So what we're working on is building a public infrastructure for ecological data management, ecological claims management, and ecological asset issuance. And it just so happens that, if you're abstracting things down to that layer, carbon markets are the current place where society is placing value on, sort of a negative externality, positive externality process, and bringing the cost of carbon emissions onto corporate balance sheets and offsetting that with carbon credits, right? But fundamentally, if you take a step back, what we're really aiming to do is create sort of a community-owned, plausibly neutral system for originating these all-important ecological assets, these new, green money Legos, or however you want to speak about it. And I think we have a perspective that really needs its own sovereign, neutral, and community-owned space, that if you build that on other infrastructure, you're going to end up having incentives that start to sort of tweak the asset issuance in the financialization process and in the search for liquidity that actually undermine the integrity, which is the foundation for a regenerative finance movement. So at Regen Network, we're really aiming to build community around, and it's a heavy lift, but the process of originating high quality ecological assets and asking and answering the questions, how do we generate legitimacy in that process?
I get really excited about this because this is the platform that we will need to have biodiversity credits or have assigned value to other things that we know are so integral to habitat and kind of life restoration or life sustainability on the planet. And right now we're rebuilding a system every time we want to create a new cycle of value. And so building a platform for that to persist. Also, Gregory is a regenerative farmer, has written books that revolutionized kind of the regenerative space. So thank you for all of your work in that space to date. And I actually want to start with a question to you, because you've talked about regeneration specifically, and I think you're creating an infrastructure for kind of any kind of natural asset product to come online, but regeneration for you is very local. So talk about that.
Yeah, so I sort of like to say, if we're going to create proof of regeneration, it is always going to be place specific and context specific. We may have these global, we have one atmosphere as a biosphere. So there is sort of a, atmospheric carbon is a global phenomena, but ecological regeneration is a local phenomena. Water quality is a local phenomena. Air quality is a local phenomena. There are point sources for the pollution, or there are, forests that are conserved that have specific biodiversity or specific soil types. And so really building out, and it's just resonant with a couple of panels ago, they were talking about hyperlocal, right? So, or just last panel, I guess. So that concept of really enabling the participation of a local community to be monitoring, right? To be defining what the unit of account is that represents what regeneration is really a reweaving of the cultural and the ecological to sort of create that unit, right? And so for us, that's really essential. If we get into these sort of totalizing protocols where we're aiming for standardized units and all of these things prematurely, we miss the need to be building sort of a grassroots process around generating legitimacy and impact and integrity. And so, everything, I think there's probably a common thread here, but everything we're aiming to do is to build the tools and the community to explore that sort of local regeneration, monitoring, measuring, and then being able to sort of verify that that's taking place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's actually some interesting tension, I think, to the standardization that is required for things like what Claudio is doing with Planet Watch, right? That there obviously is some, and you've talked about this a bit, that there needs to be a very different way of doing scientific kind of rulemaking and figuring out what the standards are, and getting scientists to actually collaborate in a different way is in itself its own challenge.
Sort of a dichotomy, right? That we need to have, we think of it as sort of standards or schema registries, and tools for calibration and things like that. So you do want people to generate consensus around the right way to calibrate an instrument or the right methodology to measure something, but you also need to have spaciousness for people to innovate on that and not sort of like bureaucratically smash that. And so I think that is a very interesting tension that we all live with.
And that's actually kind of at the core of a lot of what you're doing, Charlene, and what your organization's doing with Vita Water, and this belief of kind of having distributed water purification and water sustainability. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how these localized systems can happen and what that allows people to do to manage these kind of potentially oppressive forces?
Yeah, sure. So even in a place like Texas, there are still just a tremendous number of people who live without basic water services. We don't really have good numbers here, I think partly because we intentionally don't count, but the state does count in 6 counties and has discovered about 140,000 Texans who have no water services whatsoever. That's 6 counties out of 254 counties. So this is really a pervasive problem. And it's a problem that doesn't just exist here in Texas. If you go to really any tribal nation, if you go to Appalachia, if you go to Central Valley in California, just here in the United States, not to speak of the broader world, you have many, many humans who have been left behind by the 20th century water supply solution, which is a centralized water utility that works really well. It helped us solve the problem that really rampaged so many cities in the 19th century, where you had people who would somewhat routinely die of cholera outbreaks. But it doesn't work when you have people who live in deeply rural places, who may live on land that is, they're not legally there. They've built a home, but it's not legally platted, and so a service will never be extended to them. And in those sorts of contexts, what we've seen emerging in decentralized water in the form of, a lot of the skyscrapers you see here in downtown Austin, which were built to intercept forms of water that are growing, forms of water like air conditioning condensate, right? We have more tonnage of air conditioning going on online every year here in real estate throughout Texas. You have more air conditioning days thanks to climate change. You have greater humidity. That's a growing supply wedge for water supply, one we often discount. And it's theoretically possible today, it's absolutely possible right now to capture that water and use it for all of your non-potable, non-drinking water purposes. I believe there's a future in which that water can be legally treated to be safely ingested as well, used for safe drinking water. That opportunity set is not going to just naturally come online for the people who today are left behind by the 20th century model of a water utility and drinking water. And so that was really what we were pursuing when we formed our public benefit corporation, Vita Water, which is entering into a non-regulated space in the water world. We'll be providing point-of-use water treatment, basically under-sink reverse osmosis or carbon filtration for even people who live in urban areas but who don't have safe water, maybe because of lead. And ultimately, we hope to become the first decentralized water utility in Texas, potentially in the United States, delivering that safe water and the security of knowing that there is someone who is consistently monitoring the quality of that water, but going from, in every city has 1 to 3 water treatment plants, and it's easy to have an operator pulling a water quality sample on the hour or every 24 hours, to suddenly having dozens or potentially hundreds of water systems in every home or building. That's a profound challenge, and one that's it's very interesting to think about what Web3 might mean for meeting the potential.
Yeah, and that's, actually, John, a lot of what you're thinking about, right? And so can you talk a little bit about why you think about Web3 or blockchain technology specifically as right when you're thinking about building a network of solar energy?
Yeah, thank you. I think at its root, one of the greatest powers of Web3 and cryptocurrency is a coordination mechanism. So I think it is a way that we can coordinate at the grassroots level in communities, both hyperlocal communities, but also globally, because it is, it's really a borderless technology. And so if we have this means of coordinating at a whole new level, that means that now we can develop new systems around that. In parallel, cryptocurrency allows us now to create our own money. I mean, that's the reality of it. We get to print our own money now, and if we get to print our own money, we get to start to look at how do we back that money? What does that programmable money really mean, and what is it really backed by? You know, do you want to use the US dollar that's backed by a big war machine, or do you want to use some cryptocurrency that's backed by carbon, that's backed by renewable energy? And so we can start to reimagine what money really means and what the root of it is. And so for me, there's this intersection of like our physical world and how do we start to use this new technology to further our physical world. So solar specifically, it's, you know, essential that we accelerate the deployment of solar worldwide. Clean energy is a huge part of the solution of climate change. And so if we can use this technology to create subsidies and to create a new way of financing, you know, solar power, wind power moving forward, we can use it as a subsidy to really accelerate the deployment long-term of solar around the world and this transition to a clean energy future. So that's, I guess, how I see it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about, both the benefit of the communication of a network, right, and an agreement and how they're communicating instead of centralized protocols and then translation or not between centralized entities, and then also a new financial mechanism for development of this infrastructure. So it's cool that both of those things are super relevant in this space. Charlene, you told me a stat that I actually want to have, I don't remember it, but it was something about how much, like you said that there was a building being built in town and they could be entirely self-sustainable off of their air conditioning condensate. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, that never came to pass, but for reasons that had to do with water regulation, and we really can't overlook that when we think about the power of the possible, that it also, when you're trying to provide fundamental services, you deal with an established regulatory framework that may dramatically inhibit and really requires champions who are going to incur the long hours and the costs to be able to transform the regulatory structure in which that potential can be realized. But that's right. We had a very large tech firm here in town that was building out part of a new building, and they were able to calculate that, yes, through the combined supplies of air conditioning condensate and rainwater capture, but really air conditioning condensate being the thing that works day in, day out, they would be able to be entirely net zero off-grid water, which is profoundly interesting and important. Underused, underappreciated. Again, we really exist within this world in which we frame the nature, we limit our ability to create solutions in the way that we frame the nature of the problem. We see cities as demands for water. We should look at every skyscraper, we should look at every data warehouse, we should look at every facility and see it as a built reservoir, as an atmospheric generating unit. I mean, that is what an air conditioning system is. We've got, you know, X prizes for water, offering $1 million for the most economically feasible form of an atmospheric water generation unit. But the reality is that every single building in Texas has been built in the last 40 years, just happens to be generating water from the atmosphere and not doing it intentionally. It's just doing it because we're trying to, you know, not being incredibly hot.
That's amazing, right? And I think it's so cool to think about assigning that a value as a different kind of natural asset, because it is. And it's crazy that in this time where we do need water, that we're letting regulation get, for good reasons though, get in the way of us really valuing it and utilizing it and kind of appreciating construction in a completely different way. So I think that's so cool. Claudio, you are like in the thick of actually some of these kind of gnarly problems and thinking about how much administration that your organization wants to do of hardware. And specifically, you started out really as like a Web2 or a more traditional company where you were managing all of the assets and all of the different sensors and the network. And now you're moving away from that. And can you talk about like why and what that enables, kind of that move towards decentralization?
Yes, thank you. So in my mindset, if you want to start a very innovative, disruptive project and you want to start it fast in the right way, you're kind of bound to start Web 2. I mean, you need leadership, you need financial resources, you need a structure. So kind of start Web 2. What happened to us, we did start Web 2, we set up a company, we funded it the traditional way, we started selling products and services the traditional way, issuing the bills, refund policy and blah, blah, blah. the thing that was decentralized in Web3 from the start was the network deployment activity, because the core idea was to incentivize community-based deployment of hardware, sensors. So from day one, we had communities deploying sensors, which was great. Now we're going to reach the next level of decentralization, which is crucial, because the whole point of the exercise is to get green data, we call it, so environmentally relevant big data, exploit them, extract value from them, scientific and business value. And what we're going to do next, which is delivering APIs, which would enable essentially anybody to leverage our data, from the likes of Google all the way down to local consulting firms and service providers to local government. That is a big step for us. Everybody has equal rights to access and use this data. And I would call it decentralizing business development if you want to think Web 2. I mean, in a Web 2 world, we as a company will set up subsidiaries in all countries in the world, hire staff to go and knock doors, which is crazy, non-scalable, non-transparent, and non-Web 3. While if you build a valuable asset, you say this belongs to the community, anybody can access the asset on equal grounds, then everybody can be, well, every qualified person and entity can be a business developer, and everything is frictionless and valuable. So that we're going towards a direction where all the key processes will be managed via smart contracts, which means you very transparently, you contribute to the project, you use our utility token to gain access to resources, and then you leverage them in any creative way you can think of.
I think what's so cool is that I remember when APIs first became products that were important for organizations to develop, and I think that this was the hope, was that anybody could build on them, but there was always still a centralization of decision making and a centralization of the kind of benefits of anybody accessing those APIs. But the fact that the payment for access to those will in fact go to the infrastructure which is distributed is just so fundamentally different. And I think that that's, it's truly almost a marriage of the best of Web 2 and the best of Web 3, or one of the best ones that I've seen. So I think that that's a very cool, like the business models worked well together in this particular instance. And I'm sure that it's a lot bumpier. There's probably a lot of...
It is bumpy, but if you allow me to, we are trying to strike a balance between two conflicting things, which is on one hand having a grassroots citizen science project, on the other hand having science-grade data, and that's really a bit of a challenge. And on the other hand, to have a Web3 access to data and to achieve also business goals, Web3 business goals, because a large fraction of the revenues are redistributed to the community. So trying to put the best of Web 2 and Web 3 together in a way.
That's fantastic. And I wish we had like 2 hours, honestly, with this group, selfishly. But thank you all so much for this brief time we had together. I'm so happy you all know each other now. Also, I think that that's really important. I have one last question that I'm going to ask everybody to answer as quickly as possible. If you could summarize this particular moment in time for the environment from your perspective. Gregory, I'll start with you.
We are nature healing herself.
Nice, thank you. John?
If it's just one word, I think I'd say hopeful. And I hope we're moving towards abundance.
So optimistic. Thanks, you both.
The world at this point, no part of the world is untouched by man. We live within an engineered world. Our solutions are inevitably going to be engineered, but if we have the ability to look at what we can design to mimic nature, I think that is a fundamental part of how we solve the resource equity gap for human beings while also being able to live in a way that is sustainable.
Claudio.
We all have to fight for a healthy environment, which is not just about equality, it includes a peaceful environment, because war is the greatest pollutant of all. You can die on the spot, and you can die out of cholera, you can die out of lack of drinkable water. So living a life means living in a peaceful, clean, and respectful environment.
Okay, so regenerative not just for the planet, but also for us socially. Thanks y'all so much.
So much. That was amazing. Come on down. It's so inspiring to have, I think, such thoughtful people in the space. really making a difference. And there were a couple of things that really stood out to me about that panel. I think just for some context for anyone who's leaving or coming in, this series of panels is in support of Web3athon, which is a hyperlocal people-first hackathon that's taking place over the next 3 months. Each of these themes or challenge areas are things that we're inviting participants from all over the world to consider as the impact they have on their communities. So a couple of things about that panel I really loved is what Charlene was talking about when it comes to water. Water access is something that's definitely a global issue, but the way she's approaching it, right, is through a deep understanding of how water in Texas works. And that's sort of what we're saying when we're talking about hyperlocal. You have to understand the way the system exists in the place where you live before you start thinking about scale. The other thing that was talked about was regulation and sort of the role regulation can play in various pieces of developing your solution. And one thing that's going to come up, we have 2 months in Web3athon that are just dedicated to thinking about the problem you're trying to solve. And so it's a great opportunity to really think, like, damn, why isn't this going to work? Like, is there regulation that's in the way? How can I solve those problems? How can I find people to collaborate with to help address some of those needs? And so I think that being thoughtful about that is going to be so important as we're starting Web3athon and really kicking it off. And finally, we're talking about how we live in an engineered world and how our solutions are going to have to be engineered to many of the problems that we're having today. And when Charlene was talking about biomimicry, it reminded me of one thing Lauren talks about, which is mycelium, which is mushrooms. There's so much to learn from the way the world is today. There's nothing more hyperlocal than our environment the way it is today. But since we're talking about the importance of hyperlocality, another place that's manifested, especially recently, is when it comes to disaster relief and response, which is the final session for today and the 5th of Web3athon's challenges. Joining us today to moderate this panel is Rakia Reynolds. And it's been such a delight to meet Rakia through this process because she's really a champion of creating sustainable and meaningful products in Web3. She's paving the way for those products. She actually introduced us to Sheila Marcello yesterday. I don't know if you had a chance to watch her, but Rakia is paving the way for meaningful projects in Web3 through being an advisor and amplifier of people, products, and places at her firm Sky Blue Media. The other thing that I love about Rakia is she takes a really thoughtful approach to communication and the way inclusivity shows up in communication. So she's going to bring such an important lens to this conversation about disaster relief and response and the way it might manifest on the blockchain. Rakia, come on up. Just talking into it.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, I am so excited about this last panel. I'm going to actually sit down and introduce you to all of the panelists. I think since we only have 25 minutes, just come on out. We have Robbie Greenfield, Antonio Garcia Martinez, Jane Kartovkoski, Joseph Thompson, and I'm going to give you all some quick stats about each person, and we're gonna just dive in on this conversation. I wanna just tell you why I'm so passionate and excited to meet all of you. Last year was so my background in the world of communications, I have to do a lot of crisis comms and urgent care communications, and researching what other people do helps to sort of inspire or provoke thought. And so when Trisha asked me to moderate this panel, I went down, the rabbit hole of researching all of you, and you're all fascinating, and I can't wait for everybody to meet you a little more intimately. So Robbie Greenfield, former head of social impact at Consensus. And here's what I love. You deployed one of the world's first crypto-based humanitarian aid programs, Worker Voice program, and grant management programs, included being awarded the U.S. State Department's first blockchain grant. Snaps and claps to you. All right, and then we have Antonio Garcia Martinez, who also is affectionately called AGM on Twitter by other podcasters. Antonio founded a startup that sold to Twitter, built part of Facebook's early system, wrote a New York Times best-selling memoir about his time in tech, and currently writes and podcasts at the Pull Request. He's a fellow at the Lincoln Network, not the Lincoln Project. So snaps and claps to you for that. Yes, we definitely cannot mess that up. And Jane is the head of risk and compliance at the Cello Foundation, where she helps Cello achieve its mission of building conditions of prosperity and financial inclusion for all. Prior to the Cello Foundation, Jane was a trial attorney and human trafficking finance specialist with the U.S. Department of Justice. And I told Jane, she has done a very good job of keeping her profile clean because I found no research and no videos of her online. So snaps and claps to Jane for that. And lastly, Joseph Thompson is the CEO of Aid Tech, the first company in the world to use blockchain technology for international and disaster relief aid. Aid Tech to date has provided digital ID to over 400,000 users globally. Tell us if those numbers have changed, and delivered over $300 million in aid. And Joseph is also the UN Sustainable Development Goals pioneer for blockchain technology. So, ooh, y'all doing it. Y'all are really doing it. So here's the thing. My first question to you all is, you all have fascinating paths and have taken, some of you have taken some non-linear approaches to solving challenges and doing the work that you do. Would love for you all to give everyone the story behind your glory and how you got here. Go first? Go ahead.
I can be real quick. And so I come from an activist background and also an engineer. And so really, I got into blockchain technology mainly around the time that Trayvon Martin was murdered. So I got into it a little bit before then, but in terms as a builder, that's when I started to map, okay, how can I use my engineering ability to help my community, as a black man in the United States, but also the diaspora more generally. And so at the time, obviously, there was no full-time blockchain anything. And so, I had forays at Goldman and Cisco and other corporates until I had landed at Consensus. And really, it was just, again, how can you make dApps that actually have pragmatic value? And I was talking to Joseph just about this. I think that is the thing that's going to be as lasting as anything within the space. And that's given me the opportunity to work with amazing organizations, such as multinational NGOs like Oxfam and Red Cross and others, but then also just meet amazing people within the communities that we're affecting and change the way that we create those tools. And so that's a very quick summary. All comes from trying to be as impactful to those who are like me or who have come from backgrounds like myself in terms of being a part of underserved communities.
I want to quickly ask you, Robbie, for people, and I know we're streaming, and there are folks that may not understand some of the terminology that we're using in the world of Web3. There's DeFi, and you just talked about dApps. Talk to us about what that is and how people can utilize them.
Yeah, absolutely. So dApps is just a short term for a decentralized application. So any blockchain-based application. In our context, it was decentralized applications that could be used in rural environments, either to facilitate humanitarian aid, but also to make tamper-proof evidence in Syria. A lot of different use cases, but the through line between all of them is, are they accessible? Can they be used? And do they require as little technical literacy as possible? Because the communities that you are deploying these solutions into don't have the benefit of the doubt of internet access or the best smartphones or all the other things that would be expected of a lot of the applications that you see, unfortunately, at Consensus. And so, that was our main focus. Yeah.
Thank you for breaking that down. Antonio?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I have a background in tech, but what landed me here, I think, was not a background in tech. It was my decision in early March, during the early part of the Ukrainian war, to actually go to Ukraine and actually report from there and see kind of what it was like, despite knowing no local language, and as you can tell from my last name, not being from the region. And I have a lot of impressions from that experience, but one of them, just to paint you a picture of what it's like, for example, to stand on the Polish border and watch the Ukrainian refugees come. A typical Ukrainian refugee is a woman, typically trailing 1 to 3 kids, potentially a pet, potentially an older relative, and bringing a little rolly bag like what you maybe put on your carry-on on your flight, and that's all they have in the world. They're literally, for a bunch of reasons, they don't bring their cars across, they typically walk across. So they walk across with their family, a rolly bag, and nothing else. Imagine if you were forced to abandon your lives, what would you put in that rolly bag, right? My parents fled Cuba. They also had the equivalent of that experience when they were children. Crypto obviously can play a role in that. The other thing I would say from that experience I think is relevant here, the reaction from the local Europeans in terms of aiding the Ukrainians is incredible. So that Ukrainian refugee comes along alone, but what do they find? They find endless NGOs, everyone from Jose Andres and the World Central Kitchen to even local villagers who just come and set up a soup kitchen for refugees and basically self-organize a response to what is this enormous humanitarian catastrophe. It's difficult to do with a lot of traditional financial tools. For example, friend of a friend is from, ex-Uber, group of ex-Uber people. One of them is Ukrainian. He went back and helped sourcing aid. PayPal would block all the cash transmissions. Of course, it looks a little sketchy, right? It's like suddenly out of the blue, this PayPal account is getting tens of thousands of dollars. That was legitimate. He was buying non-lethal aid for Ukraine, but it basically got shut down by PayPal. And so I think in those situations when everything normal kind of falls apart, what do you rely on? What tools of because humans actually, it's weird. Everyone thinks everything turns into like a Mad Max apocalypse when everything goes to hell. That's not true, actually. People actually self-organize and try to find solutions to the very human problems. And I think crypto can be one of those tools. Because again, transferring value around, like if you can't transfer value around, it's hard to make food and clothes appear halfway around the world, which is what you need to do. So yeah, I think in the West, we're not often reminded of that because we're not in the situations the Ukrainians are in. But I think something like that serves as a reminder of what crypto can provide.
Yeah, Jane.
So I was the nonlinear, probably example of getting to crypto. I spent the majority of my career as a prosecutor investigating and prosecuting money laundering and financial crimes, specifically for human trafficking, human rights violations, and child exploitation. And what was fascinating to me was how you can use blockchain and the transparency that it provides to really find who is behind the crime, because it's immutable. It's always going to be there. It's not like cash or prepaid cards or debit cards that are much harder for us to trace. But at the same time, I also had victims who we wanted to become survivors, and I like to call thrivers. We want them to have access and become not re-victimized. And one of the things that was most difficult was allowing them access to traditional finance for some of the same reasons that Antonio mentions, that plagues people who are refugees or asylees who may not have identification or whose credit scores may have been wrongly impacted by the crime that was why they were the victim. And one of the amazing things about virtual currency and the work around digital ID is what I think inspires me about the really amazing changes, transformative changes it could have for communities that don't have access to that now. And on the other side, I also looked at supply chains and corporate traceability of supply chains, or what corporations say they can and can't trace. And I think there's a lot of good that can come from using blockchain to identify where that cocoa is coming from in Africa that people are eating their M&Ms or chocolate bars here, and really get to how do we improve the lives of people, not just in the United States, because we are privileged to have a traditional finance that we can rely on. Many other worlds do not have that. And so I'm inspired by that. I'm very proud to be here on this panel. And one of the things that really drew me to Celo was its mission and helping other developers who are mission aligned really build on this protocol.
Yeah, thank you.
So how I got into this space was, my background's in banking and telco, but in 2009 I ran an event in the Sahara Desert called the Marathon des Sables. It's a horrible 150-mile one race in the desert. Don't do it. It's really horrible. But what I did was I raised a lot of money for charity. It was, people were very, very helpful. They raised over $100,000. So I gave that money to a charity, and about 6 months later, one of my main donors says, where's that money gone? What's the impact? I went back to that charity, and the money had gone, basically, all gone. There was no way to verify anywhere where it went. So I was quite embarrassed to go back to my funder and say, I don't know where the money's gone. But fast forward then, that was 2011, fast forward 2015, was thinking, if Google built a search engine, could we build a transparency engine essentially? So what we did was we worked with the Irish Red Cross, and we got another donation from the same donor years ago, and we gave out aid to 500 Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And we were able to top up each of their vouchers with $20. They were able to redeem in the store. Within the first hour we had like 50 fake transactions, people trying to duplicate the transactions, which was perfect because we could see, okay, this is working, right? So that's how we kind of got into it. We were saying, the core of what we do is merging identity and money. And Sustainable Development Goal 16.9 says give everybody legal ID by 2030. So that was kind of the core common thesis of what we've been building since. But yeah, I always say ATech was born by mistake in the Sahara Desert. And that's how we kind of got into this space.
Sometimes the best things come out of the biggest mistakes. So snaps and claps to you. I say snaps and claps a lot, y'all, sorry. So here's the thing, Antonio, you recently, I was listening to a podcast that you were on, and your brain moves so quickly, you can just tell by the way that you talk. And you had said, when I slowed it down, that the internet has really, really dissolved lots of trust in institutions, government, corporations, and that Web3, which I found this to be really interesting, that Web3 and blockchain has the opportunity to get people to agree on various states of the world so that we can effectively talk to each other. And this question is for all of you. I just wanted to use what I had heard Antonio say. Do you all feel that the use of blockchain to manage disasters will lessen the friction and help to create trusted partnerships among first responders, businesses, and community stakeholders to ensure that the right people respond quickly and purposefully in a crisis? Antonio, you want to start since I called you out?
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I still believe that, right? I think, you know, I worked at Facebook back in the day, and I think the great hope is that it would bring people together. And I think to a certain degree it has, but I do think the internet is kind of a universal solvent that I think does destroy trust in a lot of institutions. And I think part of the reason why Web3 is interesting and I go to conferences like this is because it feels very generative in the sense that it's creating other alternative institutions that are potentially much more transparent than the existing sort of Web2 framework. And so to me, I know like trustlessness is often bandied about as like a term of art inside the Web3 world, but it's trustlessness with the goal of actually creating transparency, which in the end does create trust. And so that's one of the things that excites me about Web3. I mean, there's a lot of tech there that's also very cool, but it's not Web2 and it's not the same players that we're used to in Web2.
I think for just even focusing on Celo and what we talk about technology, it's a mobile first protocol. So the idea was to give people access even if you don't have a very sophisticated smartphone. And to go back to Ukraine and how people are documenting and communicating about what is happening is through their phones. And I think that we can use blockchain to also ensure that in real time there is trust, because you can see if you are donating money where it's going. If you are paying your workers, you can see where it's going. So I think trust is built. It has to be transparent, but it has to be a two-way street so that there is buy-in. And if you say you're going to do something, it's all available and transparent. So I hope, yes.
I would also agree, though. I do think that there are some traditional aspects of anti-money laundering laws and KYC that create huge issues with regards to ensuring that this next generation of financial tools can actually be leveraged in a way in which is not seen as criminal. So for example, I mean, obviously, and I mean, to Joseph's earlier comment, like, we know now from, many programs deployed that you can leverage blockchain technology to enable 100% transparent humanitarian aid. That's a fact. But the issue is that at scale, when you're talking about disaster aid situations which need millions of dollars deployed in last mile environments that may be in countries that are, on, ban lists or have certain economic sanctions levied upon those regions, that those individuals who are receiving that aid via either an NFC card or a USSD wallet, whichever device that they have available to them, that they can do so and either off-ramp to their local currency or engage with a merchant, on a similar chain or similar platform to get what they need. And right now, the biggest issue to that is that there are certain requirements from traditional financial institutions, which usually serve as the bedrock, of these platforms, at least in terms of compliance and, legally allowing that platform to exist, that require things that those individuals don't have. ID is a huge part of that, social security number or the equivalent. And so that's, super frustrating. I know that, AidTech has been kind of pioneering what the next generation of ID looks like for that reason. But it's something that it is incredibly limiting to ensuring that becomes the norm rather than an exception, in some of these, piloted programs that are looking to scale.
So we actually did a project for disaster relief here in the US with a brilliant organization called St. Vincent de Paul Disaster Response. And they work all over the US. And basically we worked with a project there in, I think it was Florida a couple of years ago before COVID, that St. Vincent de Paul will give this thing called, they have a program called House in the Box, which is like $25,000 to when a family's house gets flooded to buy table and chairs and so on. But the problem is the logistics, and if the roads are down, telecommunication systems are down, whatever. So it's a very manual process. So what we've been working with them is how do we create a wallet for the survivor, as you mentioned earlier on, that survivor self-verifies them on or self-provisions. These organizations have to verify this user, but that user will then have a credential they can reuse again and again and again. So now they can just top up the individuals where they can actually go to a Walmart or wherever to actually buy the products that they need. And then you've got the transparency of using blockchain. We're actually going to ramp up this pilot project with them, I think, in Tennessee in August, which is really, really cool. So, like, there's some brilliant organizations here. Like, you have FEMA. You know, it's unfortunately, and this sounds horrible, but it's true, natural disasters are a growing business, if you want to put it that way, right? So how do you serve people quicker? So, you know, you can pull in the oracles from Chainlink, and you can have forecast-based financing that can actually trigger automated payouts to verified wallets depending on weather conditions, which has never been possible to do before. So there's some really great things that need to be done, but I think it's a marriage of Web 2 and Web 3. You can't have one without the other from, you know, the conversations that we've been having. So, but again, it adds that layers of transparency and enables the individuals to prove who they are with credentials they've got from an organization previously.
And you'd hope that those credentials can then, since they're verified, be used in traditional finance. So you need that bridge to accept it. And I think that's where those partnerships need to form.
And just add on to that point, so with these end individuals or survivors, when their house gets flooded, they don't have any like proof of who they are or the funding, but if they show their credentials, they can get insurance and they get payouts quicker to rebuild and have better resiliency across the nation here. So a lot of innovations, you know, some great organizations here in the US that is doing it.
Speaking of, you know, lots of organizations, what do you all think about, you know, the fact that so many communities are creating their own blockchain solutions for emergency management? Do you think that those efforts will hinder relief efforts, or do you think that there is a time that you see one global disaster management system that will be in place for emergencies of all sizes?
I think that, I mean, I think it's good, one, that you have different modalities in terms of how money is collected and then dispersed. You know, so for example, I mean, obviously there are, you know, impact DAOs that, you know, have decentralized funders and they, you know, organize around community grants. And you have like things like the Giving Block that take, you know, on-ramps from credit cards and bank accounts, you know, to settle donations, you know, in cryptocurrencies. I think that there are a lot of aspects of the, you know, kind of philanthropic value chain that require different modalities and thus, you know, enable opportunities for all these different tools. I do think, though, that as you know, regulation starts to come in full force, and obviously we, in the context of the United States, we have the research proposals from the executive order made earlier this year that are going to come toward the December-January timeframe, and I do think that that's going to greatly change the context of what's allowable, right? So you'll likely not see, you know, a lot of those tools just using cryptocurrencies more generally. There probably will be an increasing preference towards stablecoins, and even more towards stablecoins that are more institutionalized. And so in that case, like USDC is probably going to be favored in a lot of different ways, and I think the future for other forms of collateralized stablecoin are to be determined. And so that's where I think, you know, there's going to be a bit more pause or tentativeness in terms of which solutions use which types of infrastructure. I do think, however, that one of the biggest things that needs to be solved before we get to a global solution, you know, are on and off ramps across a lot of these countries, and that's something that like Umoja Labs focuses on. Like, how can you go from USDC to like eFloat and M-Pesa, you know, for example, so that, because the fact of the matter is that you can't use most of these cryptocurrencies in any pragmatic way in terms of purchasing the goods on the ground in the disaster aid context unless it's a conditional program in which that stablecoin acts like as a voucher. And so that's a big thing. I think outside of those different elements working toward a global solution, the last obstacle is just human coordination. You know, it's who gets to custody the money, who gets the main grant, and the politics around that. And that's a very real obstacle to enabling something that technically I do think is feasible today.
I think education is also important, and different communities may face different challenges, and I think it's important to learn what works and what doesn't, and then apply it So I don't know if we're going to have one global perspective, but at the same time, I think we can do a lot more to incentivize communities through community banking or other ways that support each other. So it's growth and rebuilding from inside their own communities, and hopefully that grows beyond into, in the United States, it could be your county or a town, and then it goes to your state level. But that coordination also requires us, I think, in this space to be better educators about how important this technology can be and how it can be applicable. And I think going back to the regulation, you need thoughtful regulation. Just like every community is different, every product is different. A DAO will be different from an NFT. Maybe the NFT can be used to improve climate change and prevent certain catastrophes that really impact communities that need to rebuild. So I think it's like you can't use one brush for all of the strokes of the world and all of the different complexities that people live with.
Antonio, were you going to say something?
I feel so out of my league with people who are actually dealing with real disasters here. The only other personal experience I would say here is another weird reporting trip I did. I went to Cuba to report on how the internet works there, or rather doesn't work there by and large. But one of the interesting things is that Bitcoin adoption actually in Cuba is actually pretty good, because it's kind of a long story, but there's a two-tier currency system. There's a hard currency that's exchangeable for $1, and then there's the local funny money that's exchangeable for nothing, basically. And so local people often have to use something like Bitcoin Lightning to actually just do everyday trade. It's not some sort of exotic thing to get money back in or out. It's literally just pay $30 for something, because they don't actually have access to hard currency. But as soon as they started getting internet on their phones, which in Cuba is relatively recent, suddenly you would start seeing Bitcoin adoption.
Do I think there'll be a global relief management organization? Not a hope. If you look at regulation in Europe, they're trying to ban Bitcoin mining and unhosted wallets, so you can just forget that idea altogether. I think it will be driven by startups. I think it will be driven by innovation, and those organizations that want to, USDC and different on-ramps. But again, the most important person here is the end user. How can they get what they need instantly, depending on weather conditions? So that's where the innovation comes on. I don't think a unified body will work, personally.
Jane, you mentioned something, and I know we are running out of time, but you mentioned something that made me think about education. Robbie, I heard you talk about your background. I was laughing because you were talking about growing up, in a Black household, how education and things were important. But when you talked about, your background in engineering and getting an MBA, do you think that, as, all of these people are up on the stage, do you think that as things become a little more nuanced and a little more complex, that we are going to go the route of traditional education for people to fill seats like this? Or are we going to take other routes, like how folks are just doing learn to earn or play to earn in the world of Web3 to tackle the most important solutions that we're trying to change?
I think in the American context, unfortunately, college and master programs are losing a lot of their value. And this has been happening for a while. The main reason is just because they're not teaching things that are pragmatic. You don't even learn how to do taxes in high school, or college, actually, unless you take an accounting class. And so just we're not learning a lot of the things that are necessary to manage yourself as an adult. I think that a lot of the knowledge in order to propel yourself as an entrepreneur are going to be found in other places. And so I just encourage people to, crowdsource research online. I do think that the time for earn to learn or earn to engage or vice versa is a long way off because the user interfaces aren't there. But I do think that they have an opportunity to engage communities that might have otherwise not have been interested in things that might be important to being able to build later on. But fundamentally, I think academics traditionally is going to have to change toward that model to be more useful. Otherwise, I think trade schools and boot camps are a much better ROI in terms of the world that we're going into.
Okay, real quick. One tip or tool that you can leave the audience with before we exit the stage in about 60 seconds. One tip or tool.
Focus on user experience and product, because it's pretty terrible in this space right now. Honestly, it's awful. So.
Be open-minded, because if someone had told me when I was in law school, to the point of education, like practical, represent victims, talk to people who have experience, but be open-minded, because this space is growing so quickly and there's so much good that could come of it. And I think innovation is really important to building it and being thoughtful about it.
Joseph, you kind of took what I was going to say, but I'll expand on it and say, coming from the world in which growth is a major focus like Facebook, like people are not going to use, normies are not going to use Web3 because it's Web3 and it's cool and it's wallets and crypto. They're going to use it because they want to do cool shit on it. So build cool shit that actually beats what you can do on Web2, and then you'll see adoption go up.
Yeah, I would say user design and partnerships. You know, on the partnership side, you know, look what's around you before building, and because oftentimes you'll at least find some components that will help you along the way. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all of you, and thank you to CRADL for bringing these amazing people up here. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And I think, Catherine, you're coming back to the stage? Oh, okay. Thank you.
I'll take your microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were
Oh, can we give this crew a round of applause for making this programming so incredible and being really the grease between the gears, making all of this possible. Oh, what an amazing session. I think it's so wonderful that we have people on stage who've seen and experienced and understand some of the problems that we're having when it comes to disaster relief and response. But I think the one thing that really spoke to me during that session was we can't have one brush that's going to fix every problem. You have to have something that's really relevant to the problems that you're seeing in the world in order for it to actually make an impact. The real reason we have all of these panels today is, one, to provide a foundation for people at Web3athon to understand our various hyperlocal themes. But on the flip side, it's to have real conversations about what is Web3, to think critically about it and be thoughtful about the applications as we're developing them. Our next session, and it's our last thing to round out the day, is kind of a different take on closing remarks. I can stand up here and say nice things about the programming all day, but that's not going to serve any of you. We are inviting Dave Lewis, who Lauren met while doing field work at NFT ATL, who's an up-and-coming thought leader in the space, and is going to share with us and have a really exciting conversation to make us think about what did we learn today? What open questions are there? And then Lauren Sirota, our co-founder and design director of CRADL, is going to help facilitate that conversation. So Lauren, if you can come up on stage. He's also just getting set up, which is great. Some what type of music? Hold music. Do, 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 do. There we go. Can I read your notes? What are the things